How many minutes then? 10. 10. Okay.
Hello, good morning. First, let me apologize why we are late. We just come from a very lengthy ECOSOC Bureau meeting. That's why we were slightly late, so we really like to apologize. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, the 10th meeting of the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development, convened under the auspices of the Economic and Social Council at its 2018 sessions, is now called to order. I invite the forum to continue its consideration of sub-item B of Agenda 2 to behold a discussion on the thematic review entitled Transformation Towards Sustainable and Resilient Societies, Implementing SDGs, Lessons from Different Regions of the World. The discussion this morning is in order to help member states and other stakeholders gain a better understanding of the regional trends, progress achieved, persistent challenges, and opportunities for action in the context of implementation of the 2030 Agenda in different regions. I'm pleased to welcome our eminent panelist, slightly gender-dominated panelist. I'm told it's a good thing by Vera. First, Ms. Alicia Bessin, Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Latin American and Caribbean, who will also be the moderator of our discussions. Ms. Vera Songwe, the Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa, welcome from the continent. Mr. Mohammed Ali Al-Hakim, Other Secretary General, Executive Secretary of the Economic and Social Commission for West Asia, welcome. And Ms. Olga Algayarova, Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, and Mr. Kaveh Sahiri, Deputy Executive Secretary for Sustainable Development of United Nations Economic and Social Committee for Asia and Pacific. We are also joined by two lead discussants in the room, and I welcome Ms. Tatania Valovaya, member of the board of the Euro-Asia Economic Commission. Where is Tatania? Can she raise her hand wherever she is? Welcome, welcome, welcome. And Alma Sinumba Lach, Program Officer, Women Education and Action Research, Asia Pacific Civic Society Mechanisms. Where is Alma? Yeah. Welcome, Alma. Distinguished delegations, I should have introduced myself. My name is Jade. I'm from South Africa. Now, July in South Africa is Mandela Month. That's why the way I'm dressed. I think Indonesia is supposed to be clapping for me now for promoting the batik. Where is Indonesian delegation? But I hope it can also contribute to my summer collection in Indonesia. We shall first hear a presentation by the panelists, followed by the intervention by the lead discussants, and thereafter, the floor will be open for comments, observations, and questions. In order to provide for sufficient time for an interactive discussions, panelists are reminded to limit their statements to not more than 7 minutes, and list discussions to not more than 5 minutes. In order to assist with time management, the traffic light system has been installed on the podium. The green light will turn orange 1 minute before a speaker time is up, and it will turn red once the time limit has been reached. I thank participants in advance for their cooperation in observing the time limits. Now I want to turn over to the moderator. Basin, you take over. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here with you, sharing this wonderful session. And I just wanted to tell member states know that we are here, the 5 regional commissions, because we believe that this session is going to give us some light about what has happened at the regional level. We have been very committed to the implementation of Agenda 2030 in our respective regions. And of course, that action at the regional level is essential to ensure progress of the Sustainable Development Goals. We believe that the regional level permits to contextualize the global goals, translate them into sustainable development realities nationally, and of course it supports whatever member states need. But the most important thing is that the 5 regional commissions, we have engaged and we have implemented the regional forums for sustainable development in each of our regions. And we are allowing like 1 week discussion among member states of our respective region, which gives time for you to exchange experiences, to share your lessons learned, and in certain way to exchange methodologies, modalities, to allow more time for these peer analysis and an exchange of information. And also, it helped us to identify areas of cooperation, South-South cooperation in many fronts, which I think it's a very important element, Mr. Chairman, because what we want at the end of the day is to support the member states in their implementation at the national level, and we believe that the regional level can definitely help in that regard. So what we're going to do, if you agree with me, we are going to give the floor to each one of the executive secretaries, including me, at the end, and then we will come to you. No, first of all, our discussants, of course, that are there, and as the chairman said, we're going to allow for them to speak 5 minutes, and then we go to you, because we would like to hear from you. We want to get your feedback about what do you think, did you participated in our regional perspective, were you were us in the regional fora? I would love to hear, we would love to hear from you, what is your perception, and we will give you now what is the state of the art in each region and what's happening in each region in a regional perspective, let's say, and let's see if that is aligned to what you see at your national level. So let me turn immediately to Vera Songwe. She is the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. So Vera, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Alicia, Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for being here. I think the member states in particular, thank you for your support as we do our work. Since we have 7 minutes or 10?
It's gone. It's already
7.
gone.
Okay. 7 minutes, just for clarification. On the African continent, I think what are we seeing, and maybe just to start this presentation with some global sense of what's going on. Growth has finally come back. We were growing at 1.2%, 2.8%. We're now at 3.1%. So the trend is going up. But I think, as we all know, 3.1% is not nearly enough to be able to help us to achieve the SDGs in the way we want them and to reduce poverty. So the transformation of our societies into sustainable and resilient economies is going to take a lot more effort. It's going to be a lot harder for us to do. Our poverty rates, yes, we have made sufficient and substantive efforts. Poverty has gone down on the continent, but we still see increasing inequality on the continent today when we look around the continent. Even as poverty has gone down because of the pressure of population growth, the numbers of poor, the absolute numbers of poor has gone up from 280 million to 330 million people. So actually, because our growth rates are so low, even though we're continuing to grow, we're creating more poor people, and this is, I think, particularly important. We have 8 of the bottom 10 countries with the highest inequality still on the continent, and that is, again, another big issue that we need and must address as we go forward. On the poverty front. On the macro front, we have at least 18 countries that are getting into or already in debt distress. So there is a structural financing issue around the SDGs. Is how are these countries going to finance the SDGs? And so we need to bring in a lot more private investment. We have about $603 billion coming in FDIs, but this number has actually dropped by 20%. So even the private sector, of course, with everything that is going on in the global economy, increases in interest rates in the United States and otherwise, we see investors preferring to invest in more secure assets in the developed world. And that is another pressure on the SDGs as we move forward. So just to give you, and then we have the big structural challenges coming up, artificial intelligence, new technology, and how the continent is going to sit within that space. And then, of course, finally, the issue around women employment and women empowerment and the overall job. So this is the context in which we are looking at the SDGs and asking ourselves, what is Africa going to do and how Africa is doing it? So maybe next slide, please. I'll now just go through what are we doing, what are the different trends. We'll give you trends in what we have been doing this year, focusing particularly on SDG 6, 7, 11, 12, and 15. What is happening in SDG 6? Access to water, which is safely managed in extremely low environments. We have a mixed record. Of course, in sub-Saharan Africa, we are not doing as well, but there is increasing work that's being done. And a lot of what the Regional Commission is doing, in particular, is looking at transboundary issues. Water is essentially a transboundary issue. We have issues of water around the Lake Chad Basin, and then we have issues of water around the River Nile as areas where we can do more on water. The good news is that we have a number of countries, I think Benin, Togo, Senegal, and a couple of countries in the southern part of the cone that are now beginning to look at how you can do spot public-private participation in water supply. And we know that this SDG is particularly important, not just for the water element of it, but for the health implications. And so we're beginning to work much harder to see how we can ensure that there is a lot more of this experience. And I think Alicia talked about sharing of experiences. So we are not only looking at experiences in water management and how one improves water and sanitation on the continent, but trying to pull out from other examples from North Africa as well that has some good examples that have been done. And as you can see on the graph, North Africa is doing quite well in the area of water and sanitation management. It's not there yet. And I think the big challenge, as the SDG says, is we need to take everybody along. The 20% is always the most stubborn number. You know, we've reached 80% in North Africa. We need to bring that 20% in. It needs more effort. It needs more innovative thinking, but we're also working on that front. Next slide, please. In the question, next slide. Affordable energy. The continent is really moving towards a space of economic diversification. We must diversify. A lot of the growth I've spoken about, going from 1.2 to 3.1, is really one-off. Its oil prices have gone up again. Nigeria is growing. South Africa is growing. Angola is growing. But it's not sustainable because it means that if oil prices go back down, we will go back again into a growth contraction. So we need the right kind of infrastructure to help the economies diversify. This starts with energy. There has been a lot of progress on the energy front. Many more countries today on the continent have done independent power producing agreements. The private sector is coming in. There's a lot that's happening, but we still have energy utilities that are not doing well. The largest number of off-grid energy connections are happening on the continent today. But again, the numbers on the continent are quite large. So even though we are leading on off-grid connections and the use of solar, many of our countries, again, Togo, Senegal, are actually, oh, slow down, sorry. I was just trying to make sure that I don't use the time. Many of our countries are actually moving into more diversified energy mixes, Kenya is one of them, Cape Verde is one of them, Mauritania is one of them. So there's a lot of effort that is happening on the continent to move into clean energy, to move into off-grid solutions. But there is still a lot more that is left. We still have about 540 million people without energy on the continent, and this is a basis for the development and for the diversification and transformation on the continent. Next slide, please. Sustainable cities and communities. I think this for us is particularly important because Africa is going to become, in the next 10 years, the continent that produces the most number of cities and the fastest number of cities. Usually poverty used to be confined to the rural areas, but now we're beginning to see a much bigger and faster phenomenon of urban poor. I think, again, and this is where the cross-sectoral learning across the regional commissions is important, because these are some of the phenomena from Latin America, from East Asia, of ensuring that we can redesign cities in a way that we don't create urban slums. And a lot of the housing policies that we need to put in place, transportation policies, PPPs that ensure provision of services at the urban level will need to come into play. And so actually I need to thank our collaboration with the UNECE that we're doing on road safety and road transportation to see how we can help design urban cities that are sustainable. And of course, we all know about the Colombia Medellin examples that we are also working in. The other thing, of course, is ensuring sustainable food delivery, and it is the next slide. One of the big SDG 12 is loss of food, and I think anybody who follows the continent must remember this sort of rather painful statistics that 40% of the food that is produced on the continent is lost in transportation, and 15% of the food that is produced on the continent is lost in storage. So with all the effort that we put in place in terms of trying to sort of ensure that Africa can feed itself, and I think today on the continent we have about 133 million kids that are undernourished. So the fact that we have that larger number of undernourished kids and that almost 50% of our food production is lost either in transportation or storage is quite a painful a statistic, and so there's a lot of work that we're doing to ensure that we can correct that. And part of it is, again, learning from experiences in other countries. We're looking at how we can put in place commodity exchanges, which are doing quite well in Latin America and doing quite well in Asia, how we can bring them onto the continent using artificial intelligence and ICT to ensure that we can develop new markets and close missing markets, to ensure that, and Cote d'Ivoire is an example of where some of this technology is already being used and put in place. Finally, life on land. The next slide, we're looking at, again, a lot of the ecosystems on the continent are one of the most protected. We have probably a lot of riches on the continent that need to be just protected. And whereas in the other areas we're trying to find prevention, here this is for things that have already happened in the issue of protecting life on land. Our forests, the rates of deforestation are occurring quite rapidly. And between 2005 and 2010, my own country, I come from Cameroon, I think we've lost maybe 14% of our forest cover in that decade. And so we need to continue working to see how we can find new methods of ensuring that we protect them. I'm going to the slide, maybe just talk about challenges. I think the big challenges around ensuring that we meet, and for Africa, we are not just doing Agenda 2030, we're doing Agenda 2030 and 2063 together. And we're working, and I want to recognize the African Union and all the work we do with the African Union, the African Development Bank, and our other sister agencies and regional communities. So we try to bring 2063, which is the Africa agenda, together with the 2030 agenda, and they are seamlessly aligned. So it's not a big problem for us. But the big challenge is continuing to raise awareness on how we can bring this together. Ensure, of course, and as I mentioned in the beginning, we do have macroeconomic constraints that countries can rapidly achieve the targets that are set up in the SDGs despite the macroeconomic constraints. That goes by increasing revenue mobilization so that there is a little bit more freedom and fiscal space to address some of the more structural and social issues on the SDGs. Of course, data. Data is a big issue. We're trying to use big data to ensure that we can address some of these issues. Finally, coordination is a big issue that we must work together on amongst our countries, amongst our member states. As a sub-regional body, we're trying to find some of the larger regional trends and work on them and then domesticate them at the country level. So these are some of the big questions that we're trying to work on. Emerging opportunities, I think particularly new technology, a very, very active civil society on the continent that is working with us and is helping us ensure that that can come together. And I think I've done 10 minutes and I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vera. I think you stated you keep into time. I'm running a little bit, but that was okay. I want to turn now to Mohamed Ali Al Hakim. He is the Executive Secretary of Esquire. So, my dear friend, you have the floor.
Thank you, Alicia. Mr. President, Jerry, good to see you. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I wanted to look at the challenges in the area of the Esquire. Esquire covers the Arab region, and the Arab region has tremendous number of challenges, the conflicts, the refugees, as well as the gender inequality, where we have a tremendous diversity in terms of marketplace when it comes to gender. Also, the 60% of the Arab region population is under 30. That puts tremendous pressure on the government as well as the private sector. And in the Arab region, there are 600 universities. 70% of these universities teaches science and technology. That means the output of these universities are graduates in science and technology, but the private sector as well as the public sector is really have a tremendous challenge taking these number of graduates. Also water. Vera spoke about water. Water is very important in the Arab region, and it's going to be an issue going forward and it's a big challenge in the Arab region. Also, dependency on fossil fuel. And the Arab region are actually depending on that, and that fluctuates with the oil prices. Then multi-dimensional poverty. Poverty in the Arab region, unfortunately, it's very high. And therefore, the government has tremendous challenges going forward, specifically with SDG 1 and also with managing the inequality in that. There are new challenges coming in. Since the last time I presented last year, there is a softness in economy. There is a little bit of growth, but it's not the same growth that Africa actually experiencing. It's a slower growth. There is softness in the economy in the Arab region. That affects their budgeting toward the SDGs and toward the 2030 agenda. There is the fluctuation, as I said, of the oil prices. That affects the dimensions of where they put the right money and investment. Access to international financing in the Arab region is shrinking. And this is really very dangerous. When you got access to international financing, that's a big challenge for us as well. Also, we have limited private sector. The Arab countries are large on the public sector, very limited on the private sector development, and then also very limited on the research and development, which reflect as a big challenge going forward. Corruption, unfortunately, is a big issue in the Arab region. And this is an issue that is a challenge going forward and the implementation of the 2030 agenda. However, a lot of, next slide, please. If you look at this slide, you will see that the Arab region has actually developed their VNR's voluntary review gradually. 2016, we had 2, 2017, 4, and this year we have 8. And we could have been 9 if Kuwait actually made it in the right time. But next year we'll have 8 as well, and then we'll have the remaining 2 from the Arab region. Is going to be Syria and Libya and Yemen, where they are going to push and put reports into the ECOSOC. So this is really a good establishment of a high committees at the highest level, at the Prime Minister level. These are cross-cutting committees, and they are thinking tremendously on how do we develop 2030 agenda in the Arab region. The awareness is there, the committees are established at the highest level, and it's cross-cutting committees. And we are working as a regional committee, a regional commission, working with the UN country teams, as well as with the resident coordinator to work with these high-level coordination committees at the level. So where do we go next? What is after VNRs? We think there is really a tremendous amount of work going forward, 2020 and above. We look at financing for developments. How does the Arab region going to actually finance the development of 2030 agenda? Esquire, as a regional commission, plays the role to be a platform for the region in looking at financing for development. Tackling corruption, how do we do that? what are the issues that needed to be done in the Arab region so we could tackle corruption, at least limit the number of corruptions in terms of procurement, in terms of projects development, as well as execution. There's also the PPP. Vera talked about PPP. And this is important for us. We have to go from the public sector into the private sector development as well as partnership. And that has to be really speeding up if we want to work on the development of 2030 agenda. Trade. Esquire is leading a big initiative on trade, opening trade between the Arab region. I think this is very important, as well as in water resources and climate change. In the last ministerial session we had 2 weeks ago, the ministers of the Arab regions have actually agreed to establish a climate change center at the Esquire in Beirut. And that is very important because climate change is truly an issue now in the Arab region. Every country is practically suffering from the issues of climate change. So therefore, a climate change center is going to be established in Beirut. Technology and innovation, this is going to be an issue. We are, at this point, the Arab region are user of technology. When do we begin to start becoming an innovator of technology? How does innovation in technology helps in the development of the 2030 agenda? This is really a crushing issue, and it's very important. Data. Vera spoke about data. There's big data. If you don't have real data, if you don't have statistics, if you don't have data initiated by the governments, and they are real data, evidence-based data, you can really build your support for the SDGs going forward. Next slide. So what are we concentrating on? We are looking at SDG 5, very important, because the gap in the gender inequality in the Arab region is very big. Women participation in the Arab region is about 21%. It's even less than half of the global participation of women. SDG 6, water. Water is very important for us. Energy, SDG 7, as I said, we spoke about energy, and also important. SDG 8 for economic growth, that is what we are emphasizing on and going forward with. SDG 10, inequality. It's very clear in the Arab region that the inequality between the countries as well as within the countries are very wide. And you could sense that. You could sense it in the Arab region as well. SDG 12 is very important because the building institutions, make sure that these institutions are stable as well it's able to carry forward, which is very important. SDG 14, I know Peter Thompson is working very hard on SDG 14. A lot of Arab regions are coastal region, and Vera spoke about urbanization. We expect in the 2050 that the majority of the Arab region is going to be living in cities. Okay, so what do we do? How do we move forward with that? And these coastal, building on the coastal side, it's an environmental issue, because now you could see that the cities around the Mediterranean and the Pacific, as well as the Gulf and the Red Seas, are all around the water area. And this is very important going forward. How do we deal with urbans? The Secretary General, in the last meeting that we had at the senior management group, he emphasized that there is a role for the regional commission with UN Habitat to start studying the urban development. And this is really a big issue going forward. And part of the urban development is to work with on SDG 14. And as well as we focus on SDG 17 to strengthen the intra-regional trade. Next slide, please. So how do we do this? As an Esquire, as a regional commission, as a platform for the Arab region, we have to work with partners. Our main partners is the League of Arab States. The League of Arab States in Cairo is a main partner for us. And also we have partners with donors. We are partnered with the Islamic Development Bank, with the World Bank, with CEDA, with other donors and other entities, as well as UN entities inside the Arab region. Because without this partnership, there is really no way for at the national level that they could execute and implement the 2030 agenda. So we need really a collective effort to work going forward, and that's after VNR. Once we decided what we are going to do, we need this partnership important. So next slide, please. Okay. Esquire as a platform, Esquire has actually had a tremendous number of events that brings all of the Arab region together. Last year, from July to July, we had 200 events, and these are majority of people. 15,000 people came to Beirut to, in conferences, workshop, and to work together on issues that have really major impact at the national level, as well as transboundary, which is the regional issues. 15,000 people, that's a lot of people coming in to do capacity building, to talk about innovation, talk about the issues that are important. One minister, actually, 2 weeks ago, said to me, he said, you know what, this is the first time we feel that Esquire, now it's a platform for the Arab region to sit down and talk about issues that are really matters to our national interest. And these are really very important for all of us. So in the Arab Sustainable Development Forum for Sustainable Development, 200 people sat and discussed very, very in details issues about implementation of the 2030 agenda at the national level, as well as across transboundary issues. Next, please. So how do we go about reaching the Sustainable Development Goals? Media is important to us, and I think awareness in the Arab region becomes very, very important. And we are reaching out. We are reaching out to universities, we are reaching out to the private sector, we are reaching out also to the civil societies, to the NGOs, we are reaching out to the media, hardcore and soft media as well, because I think awareness is part of making the public aware that 2030 agenda going forward is something that we need to accomplish. So by conferencing, by going on TV, by going on Twitter, we are really very active on Twitter because we think it's a media that we could reach the awareness of 2030 as well as for government. One thing that the government start working in the Arab region is trying to budget for the implementation of 2030 agenda going forward. And I think this is important. If the government start thinking about financing and putting it in the budget of how to finance 2030 agenda, I think this is really important. Next slide. So I have to leave you with final messages. What are the messages that we have at Esquire going forward? First of all, we have to have an institutional stability and ability to rebuild. We have to rebuild on what we do on the progress as we go forward. We have submitted the VNR, then what's next? Is that we have to come back and build and build on the stability of these institutions. Second, leading into cultural change. We have to have a mentality and cultural change in the Arab regions so we could actually go forward. Third, regional issues, regional solutions for regional issues. And this is very specific for the region. There are specific issues that require regional solutions by themselves. And finally, we ask you as the member states to help us in keeping the peace in our area. That is truly a very, very important message. We need your help to help us in the conflict areas, specifically in Syria and Yemen and Libya. We need the international community to help the Arab region in this endeavor. And thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. I think both of you, Vera and Mohammed, gave us a very good overview of what are the challenges of each region. And as you can see, there are a lot of specificities in each of our regions. So that's why I think this dialogue is going to be so interesting. So let us go to Olga Algallerova from the Economic Commission for Europe. Please, Olga, you have the floor.
Thank you, Alicia. Mr. President, distinguished delegates, and I'm especially pleased to see many member states from the UNEC region. Good morning, everybody. So we start with my first slide, where you see SDG performance in our region. And we can see it is a state of SDG implementation. And we can see a lot of progress has been made. However, we have still a lot to do in coming years. is the first conclusion from that. Next conclusion is, however, we see that progress, there is remaining disparity across the region. If you see, for instance, SDG 3 on health, some countries are doing well, some are not doing so well. For us, important is, for instance, a look on SDG 6 on water. While in many countries of the region, the situation doesn't appear concerning, in a number of other countries, water scarcity is an ongoing challenge. Equitable access to water and sanitation remains also an issue in some countries. The proportion of population using safely managed drinking water services in some parts of our region still remains low and below world averages. In all areas, but particularly regarding the water, we need to anticipate the problems of the region and starting to address them now, today. This is a strong preventative, forward-looking orientation in the SDGs that we shouldn't forget. Let's move to the other slide. Very shortly, here you see the focus where UNEC delivers majority of its resources. You see the 9 SDGs plus 2 SDGs, that is 5 gender and 17 partnerships. But please have a look on the key challenges that we identified in the region. I will not read them now because we go one by one. So first challenge, creating more dynamic, resilient, and inclusive economies. As you see, for the first time since the global financial crisis, a synchronized recovery is underway. All countries in the UNEC region are now displaying positive rates of economic growth, with aggregate output expanding at around 2.5% in 2017 and 2018. So this gives us an opportunity to tackle many structural reforms that are required to advance sustainable development. However, we can still see increased unemployment and poverty levels, including in the advanced countries in the region. For instance, in the EU, youth employment remains at 15%, while in the worst performing countries, it's between 30 to 40%. So this adverse situation has fueled inequality perceptions. So as we have a promise not to leave anybody behind, we must pay attention to new and all forms of social exclusion. And for this, we need, I agree with my colleague, disaggregated data. UNEC works on poverty measurement and is contributing to obtain a better, more precise picture of the situation. In short, improved economic prospects don't necessarily deliver inclusive growth that benefits all. We can see still gender disparities persist. One number, the estimated median hourly gender pay gap remains at around 15%. Another challenge is environmental pressures. We can see increased interest by the private sector in the transition to the greener economy. On the other hand, after 3 years, so some indicators have worsened. After 3 years of no change, the CO2 emissions from fuel increased in 2017, driven by higher emissions also in the EU, where they rose by 1.5%. So as economic growth has picked up, so have emissions, unfortunately. SDG 7, energy. This is the region, so we are the region where increases in the uptake of renewables has been the fastest since 2010. However, the share of renewables in final consumption is very low, not exceeding 2 to 3%. We need to move faster on SDG 7. UNEC's energy efficiency standards in buildings, for instance, there is the area where UNEC is very active, can have a significant impact on reducing energy consumption. In our region, buildings account for around 1/3 of total energy consumption. Loss of biodiversity, it continues. The red list index, which represents aggregate survival probability, has declined by 2.4% since 2010. So, circular economy, of course, important. The power of new technologies. However, I want to stress out the need to change our behavior. Multiple UNEC activities support these goals, from our environmental performance review to our work to timber and forest innovation, resource classification, and many others. Another challenge, improving connectivity in the region, new forms of mobility. Transport accounts for an increased share of fuel emissions. In the EU, it rose by 8 percentage points between 1990 and 2015. We are seeing important changes in sustainable mobility, including development of electric, automated, and connected vehicles. According to the International Energy Agency, the world fleet of electric vehicles on the road rose by more than 50% in 2017. UNEC work contributes to create the regulatory frameworks necessary for development of new forms of mobility, for instance, intelligent transport systems and so on, our standardization norms production on vehicles of all kinds. Another challenge, promising approaches for SDG implementation, so it's not a challenge, it's a promise. So SDG 11, smart and sustainable cities. So this gives us an opportunity to deal with multiple SDGs in interrelated and effective way. Our region is already today highly urbanized. Around 3/4 of the population in Europe live in cities, and projections suggest that cities will account for an even larger share of the population in coming years, an additional 1 to 2 percentage points every 5 years. Shaping smart, sustainable cities that effectively harness the power of technology, brings together multiple stakeholders, is very important. And all UNEC activities can contribute to smart and sustainable cities, whether it is a transport, energy, environment, statistical works, and so on. My last slide is a Nexus approach that we use and we promote at the UNEC. I will demonstrate to you on one example on management of water resources. Just yesterday I have discussion, very good discussion with one of our member states. So Nexus approach considers linkages between water, food, energy, ecosystems in a transboundary basin. UNEC is a home for a water convention that has been always championing this approach. Recently, the Chad access to our water convention, what we consider as a big success. So we have many nexuses created, and I am looking forward to our discussion because, as I mentioned, SDGs are interrelated. The work of UNEC is just well projected to use the potential of synergies in nexus areas. I will not mention the road safety that my colleague Vera mentioned. I hope we can come to that in our questions and answers part. My concluding statement is advancing SDGs will require updating, developing a set of norms, standards, and guidelines that shape international cooperation and guide public and private efforts. And here, UNEC and all regional commissions, in its intergovernmental nature and transboundary nature, can help a lot. And we are for your disposal, and we are happy to serve all your needs. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Olga, for providing us, especially this idea of nexus. I think that's a very powerful idea on how do we build critical links between the SDGs instead of fragmenting them into separate boxes. I think this Nexus approach is a very interesting one. Let me turn to Kaveh Sahedi from the ESCAP, the Economic Commission for Asia Pacific. Kaveh, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Honorable President, Rapporteur, Madam Moderator, Excellencies, very distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning to you all. It's really a pleasure to be here, to have the opportunity to talk about the analysis we've done at ESCAP on the trends for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals in Asia and the Pacific, about why these urgently require our attention, and about why building resilience, which is the topic of this high-level political forum, needs to be at the heart of our push to achieve the 2030 agenda. I have a very short presentation for a very, very large region, so much will be left out, but we would very much like to share with you much more, and we have so much more. What you will see is the tip of the iceberg of the analysis and the work, and you will hear much more about it from the chair of our regional forum, the Asia-Pacific Forum on Sustainable Development, early next week. But to put it very simply for you all, ladies and gentlemen, our best efforts to achieve the 2030 agenda are falling short in Asia and the Pacific. At the current rates of progress, as you can see from the slide above, only one sustainable development goal is on track to be met. Progress elsewhere is either insufficient or actually heading in the wrong direction. That is not to say that it's all bad news, of course. The region has seen some very welcome advancements, including over the past 3 years, in areas and including in some of the least developed countries. Healthier lives are being led and well-being has definitely increased. Poverty levels are declining, albeit too slowly. And innovation is powering new industries and new infrastructure in our region. But as we look across the SDGs, only the goal of quality education and lifelong learning seems to be on track to be achieved by 2030. And of course, universal access to education would be a landmark achievement, but it cannot be our only one. When it comes to the environment, our analysis and assessment shows that the health of our oceans has deteriorated since 2015. It shows that progress towards sustainable cities is stalling, that forest conservation and the protection of natural habitats has weakened, and that greenhouse gas emissions are still way too high. On the socioeconomic side of the equation, despite our region's robust economic growth, there is still some way to go when it comes to inclusiveness and promoting decent work. In fact, inequalities, which have been mentioned by those who came before me today, are widening within and between countries. That is, inequalities in income, inequalities in access to essential services, and inequalities in exposure to environmental degradation and to natural disasters. In fact, income inequalities have increased in 40% of our countries, and a third of the region's population still lacks access to safe sanitation. All of this is exacerbated by climate change and environmental degradation and disasters, and these are taking a heavier toll on the people of Asia Pacific than anywhere else in the world, with the implication being they compromise food security, they push people back into poverty, and of course entrench the patterns of inequality. So what is the response? Well, in response to these challenges, the countries, many of those represented here today, are supporting a more integrated approach to put our region back on track to achieving the SDGs. And this objective, this integrated approach, underlies and shapes ESCAP's regional roadmap for implementing the 2030 agenda, a special tailor-made roadmap developed and adopted by our member states. And this is what underpins our work, it informs our technical assistance, and drives forward our intergovernmental work. So to guard against inequality, our region's experience underlines the need to invest in resilience of our societies and resilience of our economies. What I mean by that is, of course, strengthening social protection, prioritizing investments in education, prioritizing investments in healthcare. And of course, what was mentioned by at least two of the executive secretaries who came before me, it means improving data collection to enable expenditures to be targeted much better at leaving no one behind. The universal basic healthcare schemes established recently in some of the countries in our region are great successes that we can build on, as are the expanding social protection to low-income families through cash transfers that have already delivered good results in Asia Pacific. ESCAP continues to support a multilateral response to natural disasters, something that does not respect borders and boundaries. We are working to mainstream risk mitigation into broader government practices. We have led cooperation to build early warning systems in order to build resilience. And the application of technology, including space-based technology, geographic information systems, has been an integral part of this. An experience shared through our platforms, and we have many, including the Typhoon Committee on Multi-Hazard Early Warning Systems, continue to contribute to reducing, in this case, typhoon-related deaths. A very, very clear linkage between the platforms established, the mechanisms in place, and the reduction of the loss of life. The experience of our member states tells us that many of the challenges, as Alicia mentioned, can best be addressed together and in an integrated way at the regional level. For example, agriculture, food security, and climate change, something that is best tackled together and across borders. So we are promoting nature-based solutions to maintaining healthy ecosystems, bringing about multiple benefits. Long-term successes in many of these areas will depend on our ability to accelerate our decarbonization and energy transformation, same as in Europe. These efforts to achieve clean and affordable energy for all, in other words, SDG 7. In Asia Pacific, fast growth in the use of renewable energy is still not keeping pace with growth in energy demand in our region. And while energy efficiency is increasing, progress is still too slow to meet the energy efficiency targets embedded in the SDGs, which is why we're working to help align national energy policies with the SDG targets, developing national energy transition roadmaps with countries to support their energy transitions and supporting energy connectivity across our region. We do this through a number of mechanisms, including our Regional Rapid Response Facility, which was set up to support the implementation of the regional roadmap for the 2030 agenda that I mentioned earlier. And this Rapid Response Facility is being tapped by our member states in areas as varied as promoting cross-border electricity trade, in integrating ecosystem and river basin management, in supporting follow-up and review mechanisms, including in VNRs with the VNR countries, many of whom are represented here and will be presenting, in strengthening data and statistics, something that we've been doing over the past 70 years of our history, and in encouraging regional city twinning to improve water and solid waste management. And much of this is done in the spirit of South-South collaboration. Only a week or two ago, we hosted a major regional conference with the UN Office of South-South Collaboration to promote the regional approaches to South-South collaboration for the implementation of the 2030 agenda. And that forum created a regional mechanism to continue the discussion, systematically following up and putting in place the mechanisms, the way for our countries to share experiences and coordinate their own South-South technical assistance, which is growing exponentially. Ladies and gentlemen, ESCAP member states have put in place the mechanisms, they've put in place the platforms to accelerate their collective response and to deliver a coordinated way on the 2030 agenda across our region. I guess if there's a take-home message from my presentation and from all of the work that we've done that can be summarized in one small memory stick, is that we may not be fully on track to achieve the 2030 agenda yet in Asia Pacific. But the experience, the dynamism of the region provides the perfect foundation for the transformations that are so badly needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kaveh. I think you gave us a very interesting overview of a very large region, I must admit. Mr. President, I'm going to give my own self the floor, if you allow me, because this time my commission comes in. Thank you. Not the boss. I would. No, not yet, but someday. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. No, what I want to say is that lessons from Latin America and the Caribbean. As you can see, I think one of the things that we want to reflect with you, the member states, is that today we have more and difficult challenges for the implementation of the 2030 agenda. I mean, from our region, we are quite conscious that is, of course, each country of the 33 of the Latin American and Caribbean countries are making a tremendous effort to implement Agenda 2030, but we can see that we are in a moment where multilateralism is weakening, where we have the return of protectionism escalating probably into a possible trade war. And if we want to implement Agenda 2030, we said we were going to do it through trade, through financing for development, through technology. But the context today is becoming more and more difficult to implement our agenda. And in our region, we can see the emergence of a political conservative movement even. And we're going backwards. In fact, we were reflecting in the last Forum for Sustainable Development in the region, which was held in April this year, that if we were to negotiate Agenda 2030 today, we probably wouldn't get what we have in Agenda 2015. So that's why we have to embrace it and try to carry on with it, because honestly, even in gender equality or in other fronts, we are probably going backwards instead of forward. So we believe that this has to be very much in our mind. Number 4, I think we are in greater inequalities at the global level, and not only income inequalities. I think wealth inequalities is probably the most difficult one, the redistribution. And there is where globalization is so complicated, because who is concentrating wealth is 8 companies around the world, and basically the digital companies, by the way, are the ones who are concentrating technology, wealth, everything. So when we talk about technology, all of us, I have to say, only a hand-picked countries, hand-picked companies have the latest technology of the 4.0. So how are we going to improve in the different regions the catching up? And indeed, the fiscal consolidation that is going on everywhere. I mean, you go to any country and they say, we are cutting public expenditures. Honestly, this is what's happening. So where are we going to mobilize the famous domestic resources? I don't know. So this is where I believe we need to think collectively, what are those sources of funding? Because blending can be an option, no question. Changing the conversation with the private sector is fantastic, but it's not enough. It's not enough. And foreign direct investment is not going to solve our problems or the remittances coming from the poor migrants, which is the case in my region. I mean, we have $160 billion of foreign direct investment, fine, but it's not only going for the SDGs, mind you. Many of this money is coming for extractive industries, or you see what I mean, or whatever, but it's not really oriented towards our SDGs. And the remittances coming from the poor families, more than $65 billion. Also, they go for their households, but that's not going to solve our problems of financing. So we have to think about that. And then, honestly, at least in my region, corruption has been a mainstream. If we want to mainstream something in my region, corruption. So, and impunity, honestly. I mean, we don't mainstream gender equality, we mainstream corruption. Okay, so, and what's happening then with society? Society is so disenchanted, you know? There's a lot of mistrust. So, business is not as usual. We are not going to solve the problems with a business as usual approach. We need really to see what are we going to do, because 75% of the citizens in my region, you know, think that there is mistrust to the institutions. So is the institutional framework today the one that's going to take us out? No way. And then in Latin America and the Caribbean, we're confronting fragmentation. fragmentation, trade fragmentation, political fragmentation. So integration is going to be really the solution. And of course, no question about it, rapid climate change with a great effect on disasters, natural disasters, particularly in the Caribbean. So that's why in ECLAC we have made a decision that we're going to put the Caribbean first. Well, we have heard this phrase with another country, but in our case, we're going to put the Caribbean first. And that's what we're going to do in this region. We decided that. And what are the challenges, Mr. Chairman? And you're laughing because, of course, we all want to put our countries first, but we want to put the Caribbean first. But anyway, what are the challenges that we have ahead of us? We have the challenge of taking the 17 SDGs and put them in the national plans, right? But many countries have already their national plans. You're in the middle of the national plan. So you say, okay, how do I integrate the 160 goals and objectives and so forth into my national plan? So that's something that countries are doing in our region in a very interesting way, because impossible to follow the 230 indicators. So many countries have selected some indicators that could be the ones that are going to be the detonators or the ones that are going to push the others. But also the next challenge is, how do we embed the SDGs into the national budgets? Because, okay, fine, but the only way of defining priority at the national level is where the money comes. And if you put the mouth where your money where your mouth is, and you say, oh yes, I want to, address SDG 4 or 5 or whatever, where's the money? And that's important. And secondly, the second challenge is how to measure and monitor and align precisely indicators to the national statistical systems or ecosystems. And then what are the critical links? I think we have, I hope, Mr. Chairman, that next year or 2019 or 2020 will allow the international community to rethink that instead of fragmenting, sorry to say this, instead of fragmenting the SDGs, we are going to review these years 6, 7, 11, 12, 15. Maybe we have to move into the different directions. Once we get the review of everything, we have to come back to the critical links, because what we said is that the SDGs have to be indivisible, and we have to find the critical links between education and employment and salaries. That it's not about what do I do on this SDG, on the other SDG, but how do we, the Nexus approach. So, and the cross-cutting issues. And of course, production and consumption patterns. Oh my goodness, this has to be an SDG all the way through. I mean, this is the mother or the father of all the problems we have, is the production and consumption patterns. Come on. So this is where we have to change the model of development. What is our region doing? Our region is taking very seriously these SDGs, and we have 20 of the 33 countries that already have an institutional arrangement. And we recently have our Forum for Sustainable Development, and I am very proud to say that this Forum for Sustainable Development of Latin America and the Caribbean region, we have had it for the second time, and we have 1,000 participants, 28 countries of the 33, 160 delegates, ministers, authorities, 13 associate members, and we have 230 representatives and 179 from the civil society. And of course, we had all the agencies of the UN. For the first time, we engaged with the member states in a discussion of what each agency is going to do for the countries of my region. UNICEF, UNDP, UNFPA, a dialogue, no? And how are we, the UN, is going to align our indicators and our things and our programs? Because, yeah, I think you're a little bit fed up when one agency comes and, oh, I have a great idea. I have the maps with the combos, with whatever. And then comes the other one and says, no. UN Women has everything. So, no. So we have to sit down, the UN system, and come with an integrated approach and support you. So that's what we are trying to convince everybody. And also, we did a very interesting thing. We did a survey, and we asked the member states of our region, what is your capacity to produce SDG indicators? And we measured what is the capacity of each country, and what is the capacity of each SDG. And that's important because in the red, you can see that the capacity is there in many countries, but the capacity is not there in another group of countries. And so this is a very important exercise to identify where, when we can provide South-South cooperation. That is, which countries have the capacity to measure. I can put two examples. Mexico, Colombia, Chile, they have done a great effort. I have to say, Chile made a great effort from last year to this year in the measuring. And you can see it in the tables that we have produced. And 11 countries of our region have taken the 231 indicators and adapted to their own realities, to their own, you see, to say, okay, I cannot deal with 231 indicators, I'm so sorry. These are the 50 that I can follow really, and this is the help I need to do this job. I'm sequencing what I have to do. The most interesting thing in our region, I think, is planning is back. Planning is back, and that's important because planning was in a certain way erased for many of our regions, developing countries, because they thought we were going to do central planning and, I don't know, control of everything. But now planning is coming in a very modern way, introducing other types of tools and instruments, and also bringing in what I would call the budget, very important, the ministers of finance, into this. So what are the lessons learned? Well, incorporation of SDGs into the national and territorial planning through taxation, public budgets, public investment systems, integrated approaches. How do we integrate SDGs into the business models of the companies? No, sit down with the companies and see what they can do. And of course, access to information. We have observatories of gender, energy, democracy, environmental democracy, and planning. These are the voluntary reports that come from our region. You can see the great effort our region is doing. 19 countries are going to report this year. 19 countries have reported, in the 3 years. This occasion, you're going to hear from 8 of them. 3 of them are going to report for the second time. Because, life exists after the first VNR. And this is something that we have to reflect on, because we come here, we express our VNR, then what? So next steps, I think, are also things that we have to think about. And finally, I think the role of our regional commissions, and we want you to see us that way, we have a convening function and intergovernmental platforms. We bring you together at the regional level to exchange things, to have a conversation, a very open one. Then you can come to the global level to report. But the reporting here is what, 15 minutes? 10, like now, please conclude. Okay, fine. So the thing is, but the member states say, you please conclude. So all the effort you did for the VNR, just 15 minutes, goodbye. And there's no exchange of views and things. So we feel that the regional perspective and the regional space is something where we can do this. So interinstitutional and intersectoral architecture at the highest level, building SDGs in the planning, strengthening statistics, means of implementation, financing technology and trade, which is in trouble, how to create these observatories, and how to dialogue not only among ourselves in the region, but between regions. In the last forum, we invited the Europeans. You know why? Because the Agenda 2030 is universal, It's not about developing countries, sorry. So we invited the Europeans, and 5 of them came to tell us what they are doing on the SDGs, and this was a tremendous opportunity for dialogue. Thank you very much. Sorry, moderator prerogative, I know, kill me, that's fine. But let me then turn to the next. Thank you. Thank you. And of course, I have to sell our publications, and we have done a lot of things, the Caribbean, the equality, the report, everything is there. But let me turn to our friends, the lead discussants, and that is Tatiana Valovaya, member of the board at the Euro-Asian Economic Commission. 5 minutes. Uh-oh. And we don't have the hammer. I have the hammer on top of my head, but you don't. So go ahead, 5 minutes.
Добрый день, Good morning, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Eurasian Economic Commission, a supernatural executive body of the Eurasian Economic Union, which includes 5 states, Armenia, Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Russia. I would like to thank you for this invitation to take part in today's meeting. I am convinced that a regional focus in the achievement of SDGs is crucial, and the potential to be found in the regions is extremely high. We highly value the contribution of UN regional commissions in achieving the SDGs. Last year, Belarus presented its report, and this year Armenia will represent its report, and next year it'll be Kazakhstan. We are convinced that economic integration is an additional factor that will facilitate a more rapid achievement of the SDGs. This is why, exactly 1 year ago, here, during the last high-level political forum, the Eurasian Economic Commission presented a review of achievements in the SDGs in the EEC region as a whole. And at that point, we noted that the areas where integration and cooperation were more advanced saw the greatest positive change in indicators. I am sure that this conclusion could be drawn in other regional groups. This is extremely important due to what's already been said today. For example, what Alicia said, the fact that we're in an era of greater protectionism and trade wars, and we can see that this regional integration is something that will achieve the SDGs more quickly. We also noted that within an integrated association, the levels and rates of SDG achievement amongst its member states became more equal and more balanced. And what we have collected since 2017 shows these conclusions. Regarding the goals themselves, we expect serious improvements in reaching the indicators of Goal 7 on access to energy. Thus, by 2019, the Union will launch a single electric power market, and by 2025, we plan to launch single markets in oil, gas, and petroleum products. There's another key goal here, that of number 17, global partnerships. Our union is actively involved in international relations. We work with other integration association bodies, and we directly collaborate with governments of a large number of countries. We are open to discuss issues, including the SDGs, with the UN Regional Economic Commissions. Through memorandums that have been signed, we actively cooperate with the UN EEC and SCAP, which work in our Eurasian region. We have begun discussions with ECLAC, and we are also ready to develop cooperation with other UN regions. In developing these topic of partnerships, I would propose during the next HLPF that a separate side event be held with the participation of integration associations. There could be a more in-depth discussion of the achievement of SDGs and the 2030 Agenda, and this would be at the level of regional integration associations. Such an event, in our view, would logically complement and develop the format of our extremely useful meeting here today. If we're speaking of our own experiences, the report that we prepared last year defined several permanent areas for EEC work. The first was a system of statistical indicators, which was developed to measure the SDGs in all our countries. 82 indicators have been defined, and work on these indicators is ongoing. The second area was one of methodological approaches in defining indicators. It has been defined, and these are used to collect data for accountability in SDG monitoring. The work on indicator methodology led us to 2 new complementary areas for activity. The first is the development of assessments methodology for integration levels based on the EAEU. Here we elaborated a system of integration indicators that allowed not only for the analysis of EAEU development, but also for comparisons with other associations. The second new area is the evaluation of levels of inclusivity in economic growth. This indicator assesses the quality of economic growth and specifically asks whether this growth is leading to less marked income differences. Have EAU states created non-discriminatory conditions for the economic and social activities of all population groups, including taking on board gender issues? The results of this analysis were presented at the SCAP conference in March held in Bangkok. The leader on inclusive growth in the AAU today is Belarus, with Russia and Kazakhstan following close behind. The outcomes of this analysis were reflected in our practical everyday work, including in the recommendations that the Commission regularly sends to the governments of member states of the Union. It is also seen in the elaboration of programmatic documents for the Union, for example, in concepts linked to the digital agenda, as well as industrial, agricultural, and transport policy. I once again thank the ECOSOC Secretariat for the focus on the regional component. Here I wish to say that the Eurasian Economic Union and the Eurasian Economic Commission will be pleased to continue dialogue with all interested parties on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. Very interesting reflections. Let me turn to Alma Sinumlag, from an official of Cordillera Women Education and Action Research Center. Please.
Thank you, moderator. It is important for us in the Global South to monitor the SDGs. But from where I stand, we would like to monitor it by dissecting structural barriers that block our way towards a sustainable, resilient, and just future. Are we on track? My indigenous community in the Philippines has been painstakingly pursuing a self-determined sustainable development for several decades. However, there has been only minuscule achievement because of systemic barriers we face. Our ancestral territories are covered by operations and applications of grid-driven multinational mining and energy projects. There is no respect for our rights to free, prior, and informed consent. The language of renewable and clean energy has been captured by corporations for their own advantage and profit-making. Sadly enough, my story isn't an isolated one, but shared with many sisters and brothers in this room. Regionally and globally, we have seen the rise of patriarchal chauvinist governance relentlessly attacks our right to organize by endless militarization in our villages, trump up criminal charges against women human rights defenders and indigenous peoples human rights defenders. They use state policies to criminalize us and be vulnerable to illegal arrest, detention, and extrajudicial killings. How can we step forward to achieving sustainable and resilient communities when millions in our region have been fleeing their villages due to militarization that pave ways to plunder our natural resources? When thousands fell victims of extrajudicial killings, illegal arrest, and detention? When the government prioritizes the voices of multinational corporations but not its own citizens? These are manifestations of business as usual or putting profit over people. In order to get on track with the SDGs commitments, we must change the narratives of what we discuss here in the HLPF. When we meet at the regional level at the Asia-Pacific Forum on Sustainable Development, we discuss systemic barriers to achieving development justice, and those narratives and recommendations are reflected in the outcome documents of the forum. It is possible as there is an institutionalized mechanism for civil society to engage at the regional level through the efforts of ESCAP. What surprises us is that the coordinated voices of the Asia-Pacific is missing in the draft ministerial document. We also applauded Asia-Pacific as the first region that adopt regional roadmap on implementing 2030 agenda. We found it as a crucial step to garner regional cooperation and means of implementation to support developing countries. What we want is a strong political will and actions to dismantle structural barriers towards development justice to achieve the SDGs with the pledge of leaving no one behind. We would like to see governments to be bold and honest to recognize these structural barriers and focus its efforts and resources to reduce inequalities of power, wealth, and resources between countries, between rich and the poor, and between men and women. This development goes beyond the language of the HLPF outcome documents. We want a just and equitable development that puts people over profit, protect human rights and fundamental freedoms of all peoples and the planet, and facilitated by participatory democracy that is accountable to the peoples. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alma, for reminding us of the importance of many things, people over profit, things that we should bear in mind. Let me turn now to you, the member states. We are now ready to have your comments. The chairman has requested me, the president, to stay to 1 minute if possible, bullet type of participation, because we have to close at 11 sharp. So I have Belarus, please.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. We are grateful for this event being held, and we are grateful to the Secretariat and the panelists for this in-depth discussion. It is very beneficial because it allows us to gain a full picture of what's taking place in the regions, the various characteristics there, and it allows us to exchange innovative experiences on the development of every region. Belarus places great importance on the achievement of Agenda 2030 and is interested in developing cooperation not only within the region to achieve these goals, but also to cooperate with other regions, and we are of the view that partnership is extremely important. We also feel that the EU Forum on Sustainable Development is extremely important as an intergovernmental mechanism on exchanging experiences in the achievement of the SDGs. This allows for a unique opportunity for states
Minute, probably, but unfortunately, the system is for you to speak 1 minute, maybe 1.5, I don't know, but they are the ones who handle in time. Once you have completed, the microphone is off. So we have to go to Iran. Maybe you can ask again, and I will put you on the list. Iran.
Yes. Thank you, Madam Moderator. I would like also thank distinguished panelists. I would like to commend the role played by the Regional Commission, especially ESCAP in our region, in the follow-up of the SDG goals. Decision delegates, we do also recognize the interdependency and the equality of the SDG goals, but based on the realities on the ground, we believe that some SDGs needs more attention and the cooperation between the member states and the regional commission in the regions. As an example, I would like to bring to the attention of the House the issue of the dust and store in our region. ESCAP played a great role in this regard, but since this is a regional problem, my question, less than 1 minute.
Otherwise they won't be. Sorry. An additional minute. So the engineer, where is the engineer? You can talk to the engineer, right? At least 2 minutes, all right. I'm negotiating here. But half of you will not be able to speak anyway, but we know that, right? We know the rules. So 2 minutes. Iran, you have one more.
On this issue, I would like to ask a question. My question goes to both to Mr. Zaidi and Mr. Al-Hakim. Could be any mechanism for regional cooperation between these two commissions to mitigate this problem in the whole region, since this is the problem of the region and this is not a single country's problem? Thank you.
Thank you. Benin.
Merci, Madame la Moderatrice.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator.
Benin would like to commend the work done by the Economic Commission for Africa, dealing with the regional coordination of SDGs. The Commission provides a framework which makes it possible for there to be reviews, healthy competition amongst countries, and each country is able to compare its practices with the best regional standards. It also provides us with a framework for data. This commitment is to be encouraged. Benin would like to ask them, however, to go further. Going beyond coordination involves following up any progress, and this can be done by means of indicators for the SDGs. In Africa, our country has many challenges when it comes to statistical information. In Benin, we have diversified the indicators and targets for the SDGs, and only 48% of the SDG indicators are followed up and given the current statistical information framework. So we'd like to ask the ECA what they are considering doing to boost the statistical capacities of the country, so that our progress is not limited just to the classical indicators, which we all expect for the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you. We go now to Palestine.
Thank you, Madam Moderator and distinguished panelists here. And I would like to welcome Dr. Mohammed Al-Hakim, who's being with us today. Beside the list of that, Dr. Al-Hakim, you are listing of the challenges that that facing the development and peace and security and stability in our region as Arab region. I would like to say that Israeli occupation is still the main and the major obstacle and the chronic challenge that facing both development and stability, development and peace in the region. And here I would like to back to the recent Esquire report, your report, Dr. Al-Hakim, which is show among tens of facts that 1.8 of the Gazan citizens is still lack of the humanitarian water, sanitation, and hygiene. Your report either tackle the issue of the settlement. Settlement is one of the obstacles that is facing the Palestinian, whether they are in occupied East Jerusalem or in West Bank. I would like to stop here because it seems that the light is on, but there is many things that to talk about it. The main issue that I would like to raise is that we believe that Israeli occupation must be one of the, it is one of the main obstacles to the peace and security and stability in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me come back to Belarus.
Thank you so much. I'll be quick. Хотели бы напомнить.
I wanted to recall that Belarus in February of this year held a regional forum on the achievement of the SDGs, and we proposed the idea to create a partnership network through UN national coordinators. We've already begun this process. We submitted 40 states to the United Nations, those who participated in the regional forum and who are carrying out the agenda at the national level. And we would like to see this work continued in the future, and we plan to hold thematic meetings on this issue, and we express our gratitude and our hope that the regional commissions will help us in this endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you. You completed your idea. Thank you so much. Let's go to Chile, please.
Gracias,
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Thank you, Alicia. Just very briefly, I'd like to make a comment. As everybody knows, the SG decided that by the end of this year, recommendations will be brought forward to amend or restructure the regional aspects of the 2030 agenda. So I'd like to ask what the executive secretariats have as an idea of this. What are your expectations regarding any amendments or suggestions that the SG might make in order to include the regional dimension in the implementation of the 2030 agenda? Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Let me turn to Sweden.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the very interesting and frank overviews. Given the limited time, I just want to draw the attention of the importance of participation when it comes to building resilience and sustainable development. The risks to people are not distributed or shared equally across groups. And the same risk-exposed people also tend to lack voice and representation in the decision-making processes that affect their situation. Policies or plans based on all stakeholders' risks analysis, perspectives and knowledge will lead to more relevant solutions and sustainable results. We know this. And if decisions are made with people instead of for people, there will be better ownership. This strengthens sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sweden. Let's go to the children and youth.
This is Dejan Bojanic from the European Youth Forum speaking on behalf of the major group. Let me cut right to the chase. I'm going to try to be short. I want to mention three things. One is on the regional forums, where we think that to utilize the full potential of the forums to accelerate the progress towards sustainable development, we urge you to ensure that the forums play a larger role in monitoring and follow-up. So the forums need to become genuine spaces for peer learning between countries presenting the VNRs at the HLPF, but also for following up recommendations from VNR presentations from previous years, a space where we dig into what has been changed in implementation of the VNRs. I also urge you to allow for more time for thematic discussions in the forums, but equally, we should ensure more time and space at the HLPF for consideration of feedback from the regional level in the thematic reviews. This session is clearly not sufficient. Secondly, for the regional commissions to continue to have a relevant role in the review of the Agenda 2030, we need to create greater linkages with processes and spaces that are relevant for the entire 2030 agenda and the different rights holders groups that are affected by it. This is particularly important for the UNECE, where the Commission's work and mandate beyond support for implementation and follow-up does not cover all dimensions of sustainable development and all segments of society, such as youth. And finally, I want to call on you to kind of make sure that there are more national and regional strategies for comprehensive implementation of the agenda that go beyond what is already being done and across different policy frameworks. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me go to workers and trade unions.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I speak on behalf of the International Trade Union Confederation, the ITUC, representing 207 million workers in 163 countries. The Regional Trade Union Confederation have been actively participating in the regional forums on sustainable development. We note a significant inconsistency in the space provided for meaningful contribution. We would like to highlight the positive experience of the Asia-Pacific Regional CSO Engagement Mechanism. In cooperation with ESCAP, it has maximized the venues it helped create towards mainstreaming the concerns of working people and civil society in a coordinated and synergized manner. We do not want to paint too rosy a picture, however. The space for workers' interests to be represented has been shrinking. Trade unionists are targeted by intimidation, violence, and even murder. The consequences resonate throughout society. People are scared to represent their own interests, which are then muted in decision-making spaces. This reality needs to be addressed throughout the 2030 agenda process. We also want to highlight the need to bring the ILO into the fold at regional level, with its vital role in shaping the world of work to the demands of the 2030 agenda. Let me finish by highlighting Sweden's point. The 2030 agenda acknowledges that without an inclusive process, resulting policies will not be successful in leaving no one behind. Trade unions join their voice to the call to mainstream a genuinely inclusive approach at regional level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to Mexico.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Madam Barthena. I'd like to take advantage of this opportunity to pay tribute to the work done by regional organizations. Mexico has very strongly supported the reform of the system presented by S.G. Guterres. However, we are concerned at the proposal that the regional offices' roles be restricted just to turn them into think tanks. For us, this is an intergovernmental area, as it were, and as Mr. Mohamed Ali said, it's an area, a forum where we as countries can sit down to talk and come up with regional solutions. So for us, it has been vital to have the support of ECLAC here, and moreover, as Dr. Balsena said, it helps to bring forward the Caribbean countries, and so we congratulate you, and we're happy to see you here this morning. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mexico. Now Senegal. I should like to thank you, Madam Moderator. Senegal is honored to be here for the African Regional Forum, and we pay tribute to the considerable commitment and devotion shown by the ECE. Now, looking at increasing population, we still don't have much electricity provision in Africa, 46%, and it's the same for drinking water, 23.7% of coverage. And then sanitation is also at a very low level. If we look at the urban growth of the order of 40%. When it comes to programs to change Africa over the future years, the message is clear. 4 statements have been made for all of the following points: improving universal access to water, to clean water, accessible energy, to improve access for all to drinking water and to sanitation services, health services, boost the integrated water management. It's also a question of ensuring food security by combating climate change and the degradation of land, and optimizing agro-food value chains. Then again, there must be land management, planning, administration of urbanization, emphasizing combating pollution. And then we ask that partnership and regional and sub-regional integration be boosted, as well as technologies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to Togo.
Merci, Madame la...
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Madam, having heard what the Executive Secretary of CA said about the situation in Africa, in particular sub-Saharan Africa, where Togo is an example when it comes to water management, I would say that when it comes to access to drinking water and sanitation and health hygienic services, since 2015, the government of Togo has done much work so that we have a shift to 52% of access to drinking water in 2017. When it comes to drinking water and natural resources and networks, we've strengthened these. 2,491 areas, boreholes have been made, and are providing electricity. Then, when it comes to access to water infrastructure, we have a rise to 7% in 2017. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the EC for the many efforts it's made to help Togo in capacity building, and say that we welcome the help to implement our national development plan when resilience tools and tools for the development of infrastructure will provide opportunities for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to Morocco.
Merci, Madame l'animatrice. Je voudrais tout d'abord
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I would like to thank the panelists for their presentations, and in particular, Madam Masinga, for what she said. The African Regional Forum for Sustainable Development is an appropriate platform for the countries of the African continent and Pan-African institutions. It enables them to scrutinize their potential and opportunities for cooperation, partnership, and regional integration to bring about shared prosperity in accordance with the spirit of the 2030 program, and the 2063 Programme for Africa. The delegation of the Kingdom of Morocco supports the initiatives being taken and the recommendations made by the Economic Commission of Africa. And my delegation, lastly, is delighted to tell you that Morocco will host the 5th session of the Forum for Sustainable Development in Africa next year. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me turn to Mauritania.
Merci, Madame la Moderatrice.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. I, too, should like to thank speakers. We in Mauritania would like to praise the efforts undertaken by the Economic Commission of Africa in order to promote development in Africa. I will just refer to SDG 7. Despite what has been done in Africa, we are still falling short of our aim. We cannot attain Goal 7 unless it's possible to mobilize $34.2 billion per annum, $1.7 billion for electricity for cooking. So that's the financial framework. However, our country has to foster national investment so that we can have more sources of renewable energy. I would like to thank Madam for having quoted my country regarding a mix of energy, which has enabled us to move forward better. And then we need to strengthen our technical skills. And essentially, please, we have to bring electricity to rural areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me go to Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished panelists and delegates. In Georgia, we consider international cooperation as very important for effective implementation of SDGs, one of the best mechanisms of which are international treaties, namely multilateral environmental agreements, MEAs, that facilitate active experience sharing between all stakeholders. Furthermore, most of the MEAs are in line with the SDGs, and thus participation under the frame of these treaties increases the opportunity of the countries to implement SDG more effectively. Today, we are talking about the SDGs, for implementation of which experience sharing between us is crucial. In this context, let me refer to one of the UNEC MEAs, the Aarhus Convention, the convention which even in the late 19th introduced the principles, including a wide public participation, and thus ensured that no one left behind. This is a unique treaty as referring to the environmental sphere. Its principles are relevant and beneficial to all other spheres as well we are working on, including the all SDGs directly or indirectly. The UNEC and the Aarhus Convention Secretariat did their huge efforts to show its importance widely, and finally, convention going beyond the UNEC region. And it's very good because the countries of other regions will also benefit from the treaty to facilitate the implementation of SDGs. So having this example, we think that despite of diversity of regional conditions and perspectives, regions have to share the information and good practical examples under the frames of their respective MEAs and the principles stipulated therein, which are related to the SDGs, along with the very useful information.
Thank you very much. Sorry that we have to cut time. Let me go to European Union, please.
Gracias, señora Bárcena. The European Union will continue through its trade policy to ensure that developing countries, particularly the most vulnerable, reap the benefits of inclusive growth and sustainable development from enhanced participation in regional integration and in the multilateral trading system. The EU will continue to promote trade and regional integration as key drivers of growth and poverty reduction in developing countries. The EU and its member states will expand partnerships, including with multilateral and regional organizations, regional agreements, frameworks, strategies, partnerships, and policies in relation to all developing countries will be guided by the European Consensus on Development and be based on common goals, principles, and values. Finally, the EU will also promote investments in a stronger statistical institution at subnational, national and regional level, and the use of new technologies and data resources. Thank you.
Let me turn to Lebanon.
Thank you, moderator. Lebanon highly recognizes the extensive efforts of Esquire in supporting its member countries with the needed technical assistance and capacity building on many issues, particularly the kickstart of Agenda 2030 and preparations for the VNRs. Lebanon also thanks Esquire for giving it the honor this year to chair the Arab Forum for Sustainable Development, and we are honored to present its regional report at the high-level political forum next Monday. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to Iraq.
شكرا جزيلا السيدة المنسقة.
Thank you very much, moderator. And thank you to Mr. El Hali Al Hakim, the Executive Director of Esquire. We welcome the efforts undertaken by this Commission on a number of occasions to support Arab states, particularly with regard to the holding of conferences to assist us to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Esquire has organized a number of sessions to ensure capacity building in Arab countries, particularly and including in Iraq. At this time, and through you, we would ask the head of Esquire to provide assistance to my country, particularly as my country has suffered a great deal in the fight against terrorism. We are therefore lagging behind with regard to our achievement of the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me turn to Vietnam.
Thank you, Ms. Moderator. Furthermore, we would like to support the presentation of ESCAP. For Vietnam, the 2030 agenda are in line with our long-term development strategy. Global SDGs have been nationalized into 17 goals and 115 targets in our SDG National Action Plan. In fact, sustainable development principles have been mainstreamed into our national, sectoral, and provincial policy. In the next time, the SDG will be fully integrated into the next Vietnam Socioeconomic Development Plan and Strategy. Vietnam encourages private sector to do business in line with sustainable development. In spite of achievement on SDG, there are some difficulty and challenges for SDG implementation in Vietnam. For example, Vietnam is one of the countries most affected by climate change. SDG implementation demands a huge financial input, while state budgets remain limited. Many SDG indicators do not have a metadata for monitoring and evaluating. So, to successfully achieve all 17 SDG goals, Vietnam requires technical and human resources and financial support, as well as strengthen cooperation and exchange of knowledge with international community on the SDG. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me turn to Israel.
Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, this week has been a great experience for all of us. Being here, sharing, learning, and listening to my distinguished colleagues was a wonderful experience, and we are proud and honored to be part of this process. Unfortunately, this session, I take the floor not to congratulate, not to share process with my colleagues. I am forced to take the floor to respond to the Palestinian representative shameful statements. I wonder if there will ever be a day when Palestinian officials will have the courage to face their own responsibilities and the honesty to admit the core reasons hindering their development. Meanwhile, it's enough to hear the Palestinian representative statements over this week to reach the conclusion the Palestinian leadership rather blame Israel than actually working to improve its civilian life, and that the Palestinian leadership doesn't qualify to run the state, that their people deserve, to make sure that the SDG will be implemented and that no one will be left behind. Thank you.
Let me turn to South Africa.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We couldn't agree more with those that are calling for more time for regional economic commissions because of the importance that they play, especially for us in Africa in the context of Agenda 2063. We're therefore delighted that Ms. Vera Songwe is here and hope that she will speak a little bit more on the alignment of Agenda 2063 of the continent with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We also join Sweden on the importance of the ILO in a context where the nature of work is changing in front of our eyes on a daily basis. We look forward to the report of the ILO that will be produced by the Global Commission on the future of work and hope in the next cycle its recommendations are going to be taken into account. We couldn't agree with you more, Madam Chair, on the issue of domestic resource mobilization, especially for least developing countries. Finally, if the implementation of Agenda 2030 were to leave people in the occupied territories behind, such as the occupied territory of Palestine, we would be nowhere near ensuring that we leave no one behind. We hope also that the needs of women and children in the occupied territories of Palestine will also be taken into consideration. I thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And let me turn to Uganda.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Just a few comments. First of all, in the context of Africa, we want to agree with what you said, the need to continuously build capacity of practitioners, but more policy support, and specifically to review policies and laws and regulations to create an enabling environment for sustainable consumption and production. This is a very big impediment to achievement of SDGs because procurement laws, which we have reviewed in the country, alone contribute to almost 50% of public financial delays and losses as opposed to the private sector. Issues related to laws governing single-use plastics, manufacture of single-use plastics, which must be attended to, need also to be reviewed. So across the board, countries in African region welcome the process of reviewing their laws to enable them practice aspect of SCP. Secondly, Madam Moderator, the issues of the green business development is very important in targeting increasing efficiency of resource use. In my country, we have already noticed this achievement in SMEs and micro SMEs and also in industry in terms of production. We have actually realized a very big significant impact here. Now the aspect of cleaner production being an integral part of industry must be taken up. Lastly, partnership is very important in achieving what we want. And I think I want to encourage that experiential learning is achieved through partnerships like what we have had here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me turn to Lesotho.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I will be talking on behalf of the African Union Committee on Urban Development and Human Settlements. Africa has embraced urbanization as it has realized that it's not preventable. And by embracing urbanization, then we can only be able to reach sustainable cities. The African Union has coordinated African countries to have a common goal and common position, and that was championed by Chad. Lesotho now is championing the development of the coherent framework for implementing urban agenda. And I must appreciate and then thank the ECA, the African Union, and the UN Habitat for assisting us to achieve this goal thus far. But we also want to call upon the same organizations to continue to assist us and support the member states to localize this coherent framework to enable national and regional governments and other stakeholders to implement, monitor, and report on the framework. Africa has agreed further again to develop the African Charter on Urban and Human Settlements as one mechanism for the implementation of the joint framework on SDG 11 New Urban Agenda and Agenda 2062. I therefore call again on the same organizations to continue to assist us to reach this goal, because if we do so, we will reach sustainable cities and leave no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, and thank you for being with us today. Let me turn to UN Habitat, and that will be our last speaker.
Mr. President, Madam Moderator, thank you for giving the floor to the United Nations Human Settlements Programme. The regional commissions have contributed significantly to our work in preparing the first quadrennial report on implementation of the new urban agenda and Sustainable Development Goal 11 synthesis report on sustainable cities and communities, both submitted this year in time for the session of the High-Level Political Forum. In relation to evidence of implementing the agendas and in support of the statements of the executive secretaries here today, please allow me to reiterate the importance of knowledge and data to monitoring the progress in achieving the SDGs. UN Habitat invites the regional commissions of the United Nations to continue, intensify, and further harmonize our common work in collecting, organizing, analyzing, interpreting, and sharing the data and the knowledge on the regional level, interregionally, and altogether globally. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now I'm going to turn to the presenters. Have a minute and a half each. So, Kaveh, we're going to start on the different order. Kaveh Sahedi, 1 minute and a half, and my colleagues, and we close.
Thank you very much. So I can't, of course, cover everything, but just to say that we appreciate the support we've received for the regional forums, which we also agree are at the core of regional follow-up and review of the 2030 Agenda and of developing regional solutions. The Asia-Pacific Forum on Sustainable Development held its 5th session in May, so it's really matured as a forum. It was co-chaired by India and Georgia. Its theme is aligned with the high-level political forum. It's embedded in the conference structure of ESCAP by our member states. It has a roadmap to consider each time. It is multi-stakeholder with the UN, with civil society, and I appreciate the very positive mentions, although I recognize that we could always do more to make our forum even more inclusive. And if we can elevate and better use these regional fora as the official mechanisms feeding into the high-level political forum, that, of course, would be a welcome development from our side. Second point is just that as many mentioned, some SDGs or many SDGs are best tackled at the regional level. Disaster risk reduction was mentioned by the distinguished delegate of the Islamic Republic of Iran, especially the issue of dust and sandstorms, not only to be dealt with regionally, but cross-regionally, and that's an opportunity that we must seize. Connectivity in ICT, in transport, in energy, these are regional issues that must be seized regionally. Even data and statistics, which underpin so many of our presentations, it cannot be tackled country by country. There are standards, there's ways of doing it that we can learn from each other, and these will be critical if we are to put in place the kind of policies to leave no one behind. So with that said, again, a big word of thank you for all the member states and the great support they've shown us in this session.
Thank you, Kaveh. Let me go to Vera.
Thank you. I just want to thank, again, all the member states. I think I won't be able to respond to every question, but I think that the questions are very well taken and we'll follow up individually. I want to thank Senegal that hosted our last regional forum in particular. I think it was the highest ever participation, which I think, again, as you said, is a proof that it is gaining steam and countries are beginning to see the value of it. So I would really want to thank the member states for that. And also, of course, Morocco that is going to be hosting our next one. The continent is going through, I think, this wave of huge economic Pan-Africanism. And I think just answering the rapporteur, indeed, economic integration is, I think, we believe on the continent, a solution and a way towards responding to a lot of the SDG goals, a little bit in the sort of Nexus approach that Olga spoke about, because with better trade, more trade on the continent, we see that we create more jobs, we build more roads, the interconnectivity works better. So there's a lot of things that you begin to put in place as we push the Continental Free Trade Area Agreement and the free movement of people's agenda forward. So this is really something that with the African Union we continue to use as, I think, our hallmark and flagship for moving forward. And then this brings us to the transboundary issues that many of our member states have talked about, particularly energy, water. We're working very hard. It's true that with 456 people still in the dark, and particularly that last mile, it's going to be difficult. So we're working on procurement. I think it's Lesotho that talked about it, to see how we can do more regional power pools. How can we mutualize some of these assets to ensure that they become more attractive for the private sector, create more innovative ways of financing them to ensure that this goes forward. We're working with countries like Ethiopia and others to figure out how we can create power pools and packages that are attractive for the private sector. And finally, I think there are a lot of issues that have been raised around global governance, and this is why forums like this are very important. And I think, again, our speaker from Eurasia talking about how we can continue to exchange on issues of illicit financial flows, Alicia, and ensure that we can keep some of the resources from the continent on the continent to make sure that we can meet these development issues. And then the gender issue. I think that when a woman speaks anywhere in the world, a woman speaks for every other woman. And so I think as we globally continue the big gender equality fight, Africa will probably benefit, and we hope that we can use these kinds of forums to continue pushing that agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Alicia, and thank you for the countries that actually supported Esquire. I start with Lebanon, the host country for Esquire, and I really thank the Lebanese government on giving us all what we can to host us in Beirut. On Palestine, we are actually preparing the Palestinians to put their VNR. We understand the difficulties that they go through, so we do a lot of capacity building for the Palestinian as well as for Iraq, and we are actually having a large program for Iraq to develop their VNR hopefully next year. And then other Arab countries who have really tried to help them, Syria, as well as Yemen and Libya. So we are doing a lot of work across the board, across the issues. The Islamic Republic of Iran definitely had an issue on across regionals as well, which is the issue of sandstorms. And we believe that this is an issue that the region is really suffering from, and it's it's definitely affecting a tremendous economic loss in the area. I wanted also to mention that I agree with 100% with the Swedish representative. She said that the voices are not equal, and that's why we actually at Esquire we trying to get to through media, through work with media outlets to ensure that the SDGs are actually, everybody understand how implement this and work with their government. Thank you very much.
Olga?
Thank you, Alicia. First was Euro-Asian Union, Tatiana. I believe we will have short bilateral after this forum terminates. Yes, all our products are very effectively used by all member states of the Euro-Asian Union. We produce them with help of 15,000 experts, more or less, from our member states, from both, all our member states, 56. So, and Euro-Asian Union is very effective in using them. What we wish to continue and is free to use for anybody, also beyond the region. Belarus, I was present in your forum in Minsk. It was very well prepared, well organized. I'm just pleased to hear that you want to continue, so good luck with it. And I'm happy that you received your second minute. Sweden, your remark on risk and decision making is very relevant and well noted. Thank you for that. The youth, it was for me very encouraging what you are telling, that because you want to be engaged more with us, and we are happy to do that. Also your recommendation on VNRs, and more work on VNRs at the regional forums, absolutely, I fully agree, because I think we all have to find a way how to address the VNRs and their results. But yes, I agree, we want to work more with young people, and here is the request also to the European Union that we can do it together in the region. Georgia multilateral environmental agreements, yes, I know you are very active, you are very effectively implementing some of them, some protocols they are still missing, but I think we go the right way together on the implementation in Georgia. More to the EU, thank you for your statement recognizing the regional level and your will to cooperate with us. I was recently more times in Brussels, visited commissioners, DGs on, of course, transport, environment, energy, trade facilitation, and we found our way how to cooperate more intensively. Namely, you mentioned statistics. Yes, I agree. We do a lot of work for Eurostat, and we are ready to continue. Many EU member states are very much engaged. I had also some bilaterals here in New York, for instance, on forests, on water, very interesting discussions, but many areas. Energy, very important cooperation area between two of us. We are fully open and fully prepared to cooperate. Thank you to all of you for your engagement with us.
Thank you so much to my colleagues, to you. I think we discipline ourselves. I just want to say two things. One is the regional forums are for us a very important space, and I hope we can hear from next week the chairs and the presidents of those forums. I want to thank Mexico. They chair us for 2 years. They chair the forum. Next year is going to be in Chile under the presidency of Cuba. And I want to say on the reform, I hope, Mr. President, I really hope that we can engage with you, the member states, to discuss the regional aspect of the reform. I think we need to engage with in the discussion with the member states on this front. We believe that the Agenda 2030 and the regional forums can be the centerpiece for the regional architecture to move on. No one size fits all. Regions are different, so I think we have to empower the functions of convening, intergovernmental, statistics, sectoral, planning. These are the things that we can bring to the table. And finally, two things. Inter-regional cooperation. How can Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean cooperate? How can, you see what I mean? There are things that connect us. Illicit funding, governance of natural resources, data. There are many things that inequality, we just finished a paper on inequality of the 4 regions. So I think we have a lot to do in the future. So thank you very much, Mr. President, for the opportunity. Let me turn back to you the microphone, and thank you all for engaging in this very fruitful discussion.
Thank you so much, Basina, for guiding the exchange of views, and to fellow panelists, discussants over there, and delegations for participating. Thank you so much. I think we have done a lot. Delegation, I will now pause briefly to allow the speakers to leave the podium, and I will now invite the next set of speakers to their seats on the podium. The thematic review on perspective of society session will start very soon. So again, thank you so much, panelists, and good luck.
Thank you.
The meeting is adjourned briefly. Can we take our seats? Let's take our seats, otherwise I'm going to cut your time. I will reduce your time by every minute you delay, I reduce the time. I'm going to start now. Excellencies, distinguished delegations, ladies and gentlemen, the 11th meeting of the high-level Political Forum on Sustainable Development, convened under auspices of the Economic Social Council at its 2018 sessions, is called to order. I invite the forum to continue this consideration of sub-item B of agenda item 2 to hold a discussion on the thematic review transformative towards sustainable and resilient societies, perspective of society. The session is organized with major groups and other stakeholders. Distinguished delegates, this session provides an opportunity for major groups and other stakeholders to share their recommendations on the implementations, follow-up, and the review of the 2030 Agenda and SDGs. We'll hear about the progress as well as the challenges that different groups are facing in turning our shared agenda into a concrete and impactful actions. I'm pleased to welcome our panelists. First, Ms. Heidi Rodriguez. I think that's Heidi Rodriguez. On the sender is a sender stakeholder, Mr. Ruben Zondervan, Science and Technology Major Group, and Ms. Jolie Amatia, on the major groups on children and youth. We are also joined by the following discussants. I hope they will raise their hands as I call them. Vitalis Meja. Where is, thank you. Barry Varbarnovic. Thank you. Maria Isabel Gomez Monteiro. Thank you. I'm also pleased to welcome Ms. Luisa Emily Riaz Zuniga, Program Director for Policies and Budget of Equality and Sustainable Development, Gender Equity, Citizens, Workers and Family. It's a long paragraph title. And co-chair of the HLPF Coordination Mechanisms, Women's Major Group, who will moderate this morning's discussions. We shall first hear presentations of the panelists, followed by the interventions by the lead discussants, and thereafter, The floor will be open for comments and observations and questions. Like in the last discussions, in order to provide for sufficient time for interactive discussions, panelists are reminded to limit their presentations to not more than 7 minutes and lead discussions to not more than 5 minutes. This time, we'll observe it religiously. In order to assist with the time management, a traffic light system has been installed on the podium. The green light will turn orange 1 minute before a speaker's time is up, and it will turn red once the time limit has been reached. I thank participants in advance for their cooperation and observing the time limits. I now turn the meeting to Ms. Reyes, who will provide keynote address and then moderate the session. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Mr. President, and it is my pleasure to be here with my colleagues in the panel, but also celebrating you, member states, and my colleagues that are stakeholders. I want to deliver some key address before turning the floor to our panelists, and I've been thinking about what to say. It is very clear what I'll not say. I won't tell you about the relevance of the meaningful participation of stakeholders. I think my colleagues here in this panel will address that, and also my colleagues from the floor. But I want to say something that is really important for us to deliver, and it may surprise you what I'm going to say. So the 2030 agenda has been relevant because of its voluntary nature. And as such, member states come and they present the reviews, and it has seemed as a festive space to share experiences. However, from our side of the coordination mechanism, we have received maybe the situation that comes from the dark side of the agenda. What we have seen is that member states are eager to show the more positive side of the process, and therefore back home, and they are trying to have the most, let us say, intimate dialogues. But when we come here to New York, what we have seen by countries from all regions is that there has been some attempts of intimidation, harassment, some attempts of censorship, or even efforts to condition, to influence, or limit the expression of legitimate concerns by the stakeholders. And in the past 2 years, we have tried to shield this on our own resources, on our own strategies, but we believe that this is time to make you aware of these events in the past 2 years, because we want to call to your attention that next year you will be holding in your hands the possibility to make the review of the modalities and to consider ways in which maybe to devise some ad hoc process that won't necessarily replicate the shadow reports in the legally binding treaties, because we understand that this is not so the case. But in those mechanisms, institutionally, there are ways to absorb the impact that stakeholders are having, and there are ways in which the legitimate expression of concerns can be addressed in a formal manner, because we want to establish a dialogue with our governments. And you have all participated in several spaces where those conditions for safety and for an open dialogue can be provided. So I'm here as the co-chair of the coordination mechanism, and my colleagues from the steering group and our colleagues from the coordination mechanism, we are all aware of this situation. We're trying to compile the parallel reports of our colleagues on the ground to try to share them with you. So far, they have no status in the formal process. And so when people come here, it becomes personal. And we try to avoid that, but we want to call your attention to this. We also think that it is our duty to think bigger than our situation, and we believe that in some cases it is because of the legitimate concern of member states to appear in a positive light, and this refers to a hidden conditionality that the 2030 agenda has in the side of the donors who want to see positive and immediate results. And of course, this agenda has structural challenges that will take time to get there. So what we believe is that the trade, economic, and financial dynamics at the global level and the systemic issues need to be addressed in order that countries and regions can have the conditions to deliver the agenda without putting at stake the internal processes. So we want to have this dialogue with you. What I'm saying here is not easy because, as I said, we were using our tools, but now we are ready to have a dialogue. We have many proposals on how to do it, and we definitely believe this is totally linked to the necessary transformation that HLPF needs to have, both in political terms, but also informal terms, to try to make it more accountable, but also more fitted to the purpose it has to serve. I'm gonna stop here in this general comment. I also want to highlight that today for the Women's Major Group is a day to address the challenges of the sustainable and production and consumption, but also the need to allow that the recognition that corporate polluters need to pay. And this is not only about the role that governments, but we want to take into consideration other actors. So we want to invite you to also engage in the specific priorities of different stakeholders. And without further ado, I will start giving the floor to my colleagues to precisely give the floor for this type of priorities to be shared to you all. So it is my pleasure to introduce Mrs. Aide Rodriguez, who's the Executive Director of the Unión de Cooperativas de Mujeres Productoras, Las Brumas, representing the Sendai stakeholders. So Ms. Aide, you have the floor.
Sí, gracias. Thank you. On behalf of the Sendai Stakeholders Group, this is a constituent group that has been set up to promote a comprehensive approach for disaster risk reduction to address climate change and ensure sustainable development guided by the 4 axes of the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. One of the most important messages is that we cannot achieve the Sustainable Development Goals if we do not look at the matter of disasters. We need to harness all of our capacities to do so. I am from Nicaragua and I'm a farmer. I am the president of the Union of Cooperatives, which covers more than 2,000 indigenous and young women. We are a part of a strong global network which has more than 1 million women across 50 countries of the world. We are focused on showing the leadership and experience of women to ensure that we can achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, although many of us are exposed to extreme risk. But I want to say that women are not vulnerable. We might live in vulnerable areas, but we are agents of change. My experience working in disaster risk reduction and promoting sustainable development is within my own community, and I want to thank God and the United Nations for giving me this opportunity to explain to you the situation that we live in. The group led by our community is addressing the SDGs in a comprehensive way. For example, many of our grassroots members act on a community level, addressing, for example, disasters and climate change. We look at soil preservation and everything that strengthens our resilience in the face of climate change and development, promoting economic growth and the empowerment of women. And we are fighting for development in areas of high risk, and we have worked to address underlying drivers of disaster risk. And in doing this, we are showing the way for sustainable and resilient development that is comprehensive and people-centered. Our approach begins with an assessment of disaster and climate risk, and we use the risk information to prioritize our efforts and to engage local governments in dialogue to adapt to climate change. We manage community resilience funds that our network has made available to us to allow us to strengthen our efforts and to ensure that we can monitor our own work. We share good practices, tools and expertise in neighbouring communities at a regional and global level to scale up effective problem solving among the members of our global network of grassroots women's groups who are coping with disaster and climate hazards. In Nicaragua, our efforts are being recognised by the national government and our grassroots groups. They are part of a national platform for disaster risk reduction. This model only works when we have political commitment to be involved as agents of change. In Central America, for example, the Regional Body for Disaster Management Authorities, CEPREDINAC, has picked up on this approach and initiated a process of certifying community-led organizations to support national and regional disaster risk reduction plans. The reality, however, is that these stories remain the exception rather than common practice. The full engagement of stakeholders, including groups led by grassroots women and men, young or old, living with and without disabilities in cities or rural communities, is not only essential from the perspective of social justice and our common aspiration to leave no one behind. Our aim is to engage stakeholders. And this makes sense if you want to apply the talents of the whole society to solve common problems and achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We have made bold commitments and we are dangerously far from actually meeting global targets. I urge you all to take up a risk-informed approach and engage grassroots women's organizations and other locally focused stakeholders meaningfully in the process. I believe that we, women, throughout this process have been working, and I think that we have achieved to have a space both locally and nationally. We have specific projects, for example, projects on funding that include grassroots women organizations as agents of sustainable development, and this is related to disaster risk reduction. Another thing that I think is very important is to harness the targets of the Sustainable Development Goals to establish a national plan to involve the whole of society in achieving and complying with the Sendai framework and achieving the SDGs. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that it is time to work together, and in this way we will ensure that we can achieve sustainable development for all. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Heide.
Thank you very much, Heide.
You have just shared with us has shown how your engagement with national and local governments have helped advance an integrated approach to achieve the Sustainable Development Agenda. And I'm sure there can be a very good conversation about this. But I want to give the floor now to Mr. Ruben Sondervan, Executive Director of Earth System Governance Project from the Lund University in Sweden, and he's a member of the Science and Technology Major Group. We would like to know from your side how the dimensions of monitoring and review, but also coherence, are impacting the possibility of achievement of the Sustainable Development Agenda.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. It's an honor for me to speak for the Major Group Science Technology at this official event of the HLPF 2018. The scientific and technological community has a crucial role to play in providing the evidence and the expertise and data to inform, measure and monitor the implementation of the SDGs. The challenge to sustainable development has been the subject of research already for a long time. So there is a vast body of scientific knowledge available, knowledge that is important to be synthesized, to be utilized, and of course to be further advanced. In addition to better understanding the problems and challenges, the scientific community has also turned its focus and is actively contributing to providing knowledge for the solutions. And for this we need to combine both our disciplinary, interdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary research. When turning scientific inquiry more towards the solutions, There's an important role for the social sciences, humanities, and the arts. Because even our best models and monitoring systems, or our most innovative technologies, they are insufficient to, for example, explain why certain policies and institutions work and others don't, or how we can safeguard the quality, equity, participation, and accountability in the processes while at the same time improving the speed of the decision making for the transformative changes needed. And there is another new exciting scientific challenge that is now emerging, and that is assessing and explaining the steering effects of the SDGs themselves. Because the ambition expressed in the goals is overwhelming, but yet we need to ask from the scientific inquiry, will this governance through goals approach be effective in resolving the pressing challenges? Because science so far has tended to focus on concrete institutions, clear actors, and practices, but not on aspirational goals that bring little in terms of specificity or stable regime formation and compliance mechanisms. So that brings me a bit to the question of monitoring and review. And of course, that is where we can make a big contribution, because that's the daily work of the scientific and technological community. So one example of an innovative tool to demonstrate how science can contribute is the World in 2050 project that will be presented over lunchtime and during a side event here. This modeling project integrates a wide array of heterogeneous data and gives countries and organizations potential pathways to achieve the SDGs. And one major review effort underway is the development of the 2019 Global Sustainable Development Report, where 15 independent scientists are working hard on this report, which will have a crucial role to play. However, despite these valuable contributions, sustainable development, as you all know, is contextual when it comes to implementation. It is therefore alarming that scientific capacity is so unevenly distributed across the globe. Because to achieve Agenda 2030, we need to create capacities and strengthen scientific knowledge production everywhere, but in particular there where it is yet underrepresented today. To the second question, that of coherence, in 2017, the International Science Council published a guide to SDG interactions. It shows that actions under one goal can reinforce progress in other goals, but similarly, actions taken to achieve an SDG can hinder progress in achieving another. So understanding and managing these interactions is key. And again, there will be a side event later this evening by the International Council for Science and partners to explain this in more detail. So, and in generally, also to co-design and co-production of knowledge, we're getting an increased understanding on how to develop coherence across actors. But whether and under what conditions the SDGs advance institutional integration, that is, that they stimulate increasing normative coherence and institutional and actor alignment, that is not a given. One contribution the scientific community also makes in increasing the coherence is through teaching, because most scientific knowledge creation takes place at universities, and most scientists at universities do also teach. And the students at universities now, or in the years to come, will have to become the groundbreaking scientists, or the innovative entrepreneurs, the sustainable business leaders, the member state delegates, or the civil society representatives for the decennia to come. So to conclude, the transformation to sustainable development, understood here as intentional, not as an evolution or a revolution through chaos, needs to bring together knowledge and societal agreement. It requires access to knowledge and the application, the advancement and the fostering of cutting-edge scientific knowledge. It needs open science and better science policy mechanisms at all levels of governance, as well as within the HLPF. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and I want to congratulate my panelists in speaking below their time limit. That will help the conversation to flow more smoothly. I would like to now give the floor to Ms. Jolie Amatia, who's the Secretariat of the United Nations Major Group of Children and Youth, and we would like to know what are the cross-cutting challenges, including structural issues that major groups and other stakeholders and governments face in the implementation of the SDGs under review. But we would also be interested in hearing if you have any recommendations and proposals for next steps.
Thank you so much, moderator. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jolie Amatia, and I'm speaking on behalf of the UN Major Group for Children and Youth. We are the formal engagement mechanism created by the United Nations General Assembly for young people to engage in UN processes. First of all, allow us to extend our heartfelt gratitude to UN DESA, the president of ECOSOC, and member of the UN for convening this dialogue with major groups and other stakeholders. Our world is not simple as we'd like to think. It is filled with complex interdependent systems with multiple development pathways. The good news is that we realize this and we are all working towards a common goal. Our problem is that we're often doing it interdependently. There's a need for holistic approaches designed by communities and stakeholders at all levels, and it can only happen when we're all present, when we're all talking and in the same room. 25 years after the outcome of Rio Earth Summit created the major groups mechanism, the United Nations Major Group for Children and Youth has been and remains committed to meaningfully engaging in the design, implementation, monitoring, follow-up, and review of the 2030 Agenda and the vision of the United Nations. With the enhancement of the stature of sustainable development as a system-wide approach, it strives to enhance spaces both in breadth and depth for all the right holders and critical segments of society to engage at all levels and make effective use of the self-assembled right-based spaces. The term transformative has been thrown quite often in the context of the 2030 Agenda. Still, the primary cross-cutting challenge so far has been acting on this term and actualizing this transformation. How do we do this? We'd like to provide a concrete plan to move forward. First, reorient the current growth for the sake of growth economic paradigm to one that internalizes social and environmental externalities. It is simple. The economy is dependent on and exists within the environment and society, not the other way around. This includes inter alia, capture, and trade of natural resources, operationalizing the natural rights of nature and plant degrowth. Additionally, measures like ratios of maximum to minimum income, scaling of the UNEP's ecological risk integration into sovereign credit or e-risk, and ecological task reform that discourage sectors, especially those that contribute most to resource extraction and pollution, should be seriously considered. The VNR guidelines need to further enhance its environmental dimension with the recognition of planetary boundaries along with the social and economic ones. Second, make progress towards innovative and cross-cutting accountability frameworks for the SDGs that emphasize transparency. Siloed accountability mechanisms and the voluntary nature of implementation, while allowing for contextualization, should not be an excuse for slow progress. Third, fix the systematic development finance system. The much talked about concept of partnerships is a substantiated hype in the current context of no agreed definition and governance framework for public-private partnerships. These should not be the default option for partnerships. They're inadequate and unsuccessful for essential and critical services. They privatize profits and socialize risks. Moving forward, we should have a clear guideline and accountability mechanism. For example, in the context of water, any contributions to the private sector should be expressly defined in legally binding agreements with explicit reference to the human rights to water and sanitation for all as the primary goal for any such agreement. We suggest convening a process at the global level through ECOSOC to take stock, to evaluate, and to define common standards on PPPs, and as opposed to the exclusive non-universal membership process led by the ECE. The next challenge is to overcome existing notions of spatial divisions where the 2030 agenda is implemented. The lack of new institutional frameworks to facilitate governance across territorial jurisdictions, urban and rural. So we also urge countries to implement vertical and horizontal models for distributing financial and administrative capacities to decrease inequalities across the urban-rural continuum, as well as between and within urban areas. Last but not the least, we cannot neglect the structural and systematic issues that many governments face in advancing their progress. While we talk about billions and trillions of dollars, let us realize a darker reality of our times. More wealth has been transferred from the poor to rich countries within our current development paradigm. Global Financial Integrity, GFI, has reported that since 1980, developing countries lost $16.3 trillion through broad leakages in the balance of payments, trade misinvoicing, and recorded financial transfers. To tackle the finance resource gap, we have to seek new innovative and sustainable investment mechanisms. At one of the G20 meetings, Japan has suggested to use international solidarity tax, such as financial transaction tax. The European Commission and parliaments have promoted financial transaction tax as the future resources. These resources should be tapped. Now, moving forward, with a membership of over 6,500 youth entities in over 170 countries and territories, the UNMGCY, the Major Group for Children and Youth, would like to highlight how we've approached effective implementation of the agenda. We've done this through a four-part strategy. First, policy and advocacy to facilitate the collective and meaningful participation of young people in official and formal avenues of policy design, implementation, monitoring, follow-up, and review at all levels. Second, capacity building to facilitate activities for young people aimed at enhancing understanding, knowledge, and skills in relation to sustainable development, meaningful engagement and the UN system. Third, by providing a platform for young people to create an evidence-based through the assessment of existing knowledge, the generation of new knowledge, the identification of emerging issues, and effective use and dissemination of knowledge to inform policy processes. It includes inputs from formal, informal, traditional, and indigenous knowledge streams. And finally, action by providing a platform that encourages young people to lead, join, showcase, and share innovative and effective actions aimed at addressing the needs of people and planet. Having said that, we do recognize that there is no single best way for promoting awareness and facilitating effective implementation, but there are certain universal truths. Human rights are real. Diversity includes many gender and sexual identities. Fundamental planetary boundaries exist. No person is illegal. Resilience is indispensable. Technology is not neutral. And more growth does not mean always more well-being. Finally, people and the planet benefit from an ever-expanding room of empowered and well-resourced stakeholders in legally mandated spaces and an ever-expanding conversation of people fighting for the change. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This has been really inspiring, and I think there is a lot of material for our lead discussants to engage in a dialogue. So I'm going to give the floor to Mr. Vitalis Meja, who's the coordinator of the CPD co-chair and Reality of the network, Reality of Aid Network Africa, and who's a member from FFG Civil Society Group. Meja, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Indeed, let me also thank Des and the major group for organizing this session. I think it's very crucial and indeed very important in taking this agenda forward. I wanted to address three questions which I think most of the speakers alluded to that we need to think carefully about. And one has to do with, first, the issue of addressing a disaster in the context of SDGs. I think that is very important. I think the example given indeed forms the core on how we need to move forward with regard to addressing the issue in the context of sustainable development goals. Now, how do you do that? I think the question of how you work with change agents, particularly communities on the ground, is very important. And I think how governments make communities or work with communities to own this agenda indeed becomes very critical. And I think we haven't really gone to the communities to sell this agenda to them. Instead, what you're trying to say is governments have already aligned their national programs or development agendas to this idea, and therefore all is good. All is not good, Madam Moderator. I think we need to really enhance the ownership and the level of engagement of the community in this agenda if it is to be sustainable. The second issue that I think is important is building partnership with the communities on this issue. I think it is important that communities become the owners of this because that is the only way you sustain resilience. And I think at the moment, we haven't seen or we haven't started making use of communities in terms of addressing this agenda. And that's why I think I agree with your sentiments that the notion that the process is voluntary and the process that we only listen to voluntary national reports calls to question of ownership of the whole context, because countries, like you correctly said, are really just taking on what is positive and not really going to the crux of the matter, which is sustainable development goals. I think it is also important that in going forward, we think carefully on how we empower the communities in the designing projects that really change their livelihoods. And in that case, I think we haven't really invested much on what it takes to get communities on board, what it takes indeed to have them on and engage in the design of this process. And I hope going forward, those are things that we need to look into. Madam Chair, I think one of the things that we need to also think about has to do with how we monitor progress. Progress cannot be about voluntary reporting. Progress has to be about political accountability and change in behavior on how indeed we are making progress in addressing SDGs. And at the moment, I think we are lacking clarity on the framework on how the design is made to mobilize all stakeholders to give their input. I think the process of data collection is not very clear. And lastly, Madam Chair, how we are making use of these VNR reports that are presented here at the country level to spur dialogue, that is still not very clear. And I think there has to be true national ownership of these reports first before they are brought into this plenary, Madam Chair. The final thing that I wanted to raise has to do with the recognition of multi-stakeholders in the SDG context. It is not just about saying that we recognize you and will provide you forums and opportunities to engage with us. We want to see it in action at the national level. Increasingly, we are experiencing situations where there's a lot of shrinking space for CSOs at the country level. We are seeing activists being killed. We are seeing accounts of CSOs being frozen. And indeed, the amount of political violence being meted on CSOs has really increased. I think we really need to think carefully. If CSOs are the defenders of human rights, and actually 75% of their resources are towards development, what kind of partnership do we really want with them? And I think that's a debate that we ought to have, Madam Chair. I think aid still remains very important, but I think the quality of aid and how it is used to address SDGs will have to be questioned, especially in the context of propping up private sector. I think we need to talk about that. I thank you, Madam Chair.
So much, and now we have many more issues that I think we need to consider in this dialogue. But I'm not going to be trying to make any comments on my side because I think we have a very short time allocated for the rest of the speakers. But we are definitely interested in hearing what Mr. Barry Urbanovich, Mayor of Kitchener, Canada, from the local authorities major group, has to say about their type of engagement. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, members of major groups and stakeholders, fellow speakers. On behalf of local and regional governments, we're proud of this dialogue, to be part of this dialogue and to learn from each other. Let me begin by stating that there's been a silent, constructive tsunami taking place ever since this agenda has been adopted. Local governments are not only taking ownership of the agenda, but are also implementing it at the local level, and often without the means they need. Let me remind you all that without localizing the achievement of the SDGs in cities and territories, it will be particularly difficult to end poverty, ensuring that no one is left behind, and protecting our environment. Significant efforts have been made by local and regional governments and their networks to raise awareness and foster local ownership of the global agendas, and their involvement in the implementation of the SDGs is progressively growing in all regions. Embracing these SDGs allows the work around service provision to be part of the global conversation on the development agendas, since local and regional governments are at the front lines with the citizens. The progress made is indeed remarkable, but in order for full ownership of the SDGs to take place, we need stronger joint efforts, clear, high-level political support, and stronger alliances. The achievement of the goals requires stronger collaborations within and between different levels of government. One of the key indicators of said collaboration is the participation of local and regional governments in the preparation of the VNRs. Since 2016, local and regional governments were consulted in 45% of the countries that presented their VNRs and participated in 39% of the countries that have set up national mechanisms for the coordination and follow-up of the SDGs. We still need to improve local and regional involvement in the national reporting processes and in the institutional mechanisms for SDG coordination and follow-up. Wherever local governments benefit from an enabling institutional framework, they can play a key developmental role. Participatory and rights-based approaches, including the right to the city, are being used by front-runner cities and regions to develop a new framework for the co-creation of cities and territories based on stronger involvement of local actors. Local and regional government networks are also essential in developing partnerships with other organizations which can effectively ensure the achievement of SDGs. This is why we find it instrumental to have a place where all UN agencies discuss action at local levels with other stakeholders. The potential of local innovative actions to develop timely and context-specific decisions to leave no one behind cannot be left untapped. And this fundamentally requires active participation from all stakeholders. There are inspiring practices that can stimulate institutional change and improve multi-stakeholder approaches to root sustainable development at local levels. Some countries grant dedicated spaces in the VNRs to the local and regional governments and local stakeholders, while others promote new approaches to promote the alignment with the SDGs in the national strategies, while fostering bottom-up innovation and enhanced collaborative mechanisms to promote effective coherence between policymaking, financing, and implementation. Results are there to demonstrate that local capacities and national development strategies are correlated, but more efforts are needed to raise awareness and support local governments' involvement in the localization of the SDGs. Fellow delegates, it is through democratic processes that communities can decide together where to target investment and action in order to harness the potential of the SDGs. Political leadership is needed to bring everyone around the table, resolve potential conflicts, and coordinate action towards the localization process with regional and national initiatives. Our involvement requires both strong dialogue and long-term integrated strategies. We must guide transformative change and make sure that the perspectives and necessities of local and regional governments are no longer a side note in this process. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this. And now it's the time for my cruel role as moderator to allocate very rigorously only 2 minutes, either to my colleagues that will take the floor now, or for member states, so that we can have an allocated and balanced discussion between the actors that are in this room. So I will first give the floor to the person who's delivering their intervention on behalf of the older persons stakeholder group, who's Verity McGivern from HelpAge International. You have the floor.
SDG implementation must be underpinned by equality, social justice and human dignity across the whole life course. Older persons have an equal right to development alongside all other human rights. One of the major challenges we face in the transformation towards sustainable and resilient societies is the low priority afforded to ageing and older people within sustainable development planning and implementation, particularly at local, national and regional levels. This cuts across all SDG goals. It can also be applied in the case of emergency response, preparedness planning and disaster risk reduction. Major group and other stakeholder mechanisms offer the opportunity for greater recognition and representation, which is critical. They also offer the opportunity to move beyond thinking exclusively in terms of our groups, to bring a whole of society perspective to policy-making processes, challenging narratives driven by purely economic considerations at the expense of social development and human rights. SDG 11 is one area where such an approach could be effective, calling for people-centred planning and policies that create inviting, safe and healthy spaces that are inclusive of all urban residents, over car-oriented development models that create hostile, unwelcoming and polluted urban spaces. We offer two pathways. Firstly, greater recognition by all stakeholders of the need for human rights to underpin implementation and review of the SDGs and to be the basic starting point for leaving no one behind. Secondly, diverse and representative civil society coordination mechanisms at every level, bringing together all of the stakeholders included in Agenda 2030 and leaving no one behind. We welcome related developments at the regional level over the past 12 months. Greater investment is needed to develop and build capacity within such mechanisms and bring in those stakeholders who have not been hitherto included. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that intervention. I will give the floor now to Norway.
Thank you, moderator. Norway warmly welcomes contributions from civil society, major groups and other stakeholders. To reach the Sustainable Development Goals, we must cooperate, both between and within countries. Therefore, the Norwegian delegation is a broad one. It includes representatives from ministries, business, trade unions, academics, statisticians, youth organizations, and civil society, also reflected in the reporting. I represent an NGO myself, and a vibrant democracy needs impulses from its citizens, arenas outside government, market, and families, to build trust and open, inclusive, and resilient societies, leaving no one behind. Civil society is often closer to the vulnerable and marginalized, but it is also under pressure. Attacks against freedom of association, peaceful assembly, and expression increase, varying from legal restrictions and violence to subtler forms of intimidation, as some of you know here personally. Standing up to governments, companies, and extremists sometimes takes courage. It can be dangerous. Last year, 197 environmental defenders were killed. Daughters, brothers, many of them indigenous people. Without brave citizens that come together for a better world to ensure human rights and planetary boundaries are respected, we will not reach the Sustainable Development Goals. So let's join forces, because none of us can do this alone. Thank you.
Thank you for that intervention. We are happy to have member states supporting the agenda of the environmental and human rights defenders, which is one of the priorities that the coordination mechanism is bringing into this year and will take also for next year discussion. I'm gonna give the floor now to Ana Pelaez, who's taking the floor on behalf of the Persons with Disability Stakeholder Group.
Con su permiso, señora Presidenta.
With your permission, if you allow me, Madam Chair. We have a population that is truly invisible, that is those with disabilities, and they're not taken into account in development policies. More than half of this population lives in small cities, in rural areas, where they rarely have accessible services of any type, in terms of transport, housing, or in terms of services open to the public, or in any area of policy. 157 million persons with disabilities across the world do not have the right to clean water or even to sanitation. But even more than that, in the face of natural disasters, it can be said that persons with disabilities are 4 times more likely to die than someone without disabilities. Beyond that, in societies that are said to be advanced, we continue to segregate persons with disabilities in institutions and within policies that oblige them to be separated from society in general. Therefore, Madam Chair and distinguished colleagues, we need to truly highlight the fundamental rights of persons with disabilities. Let us recognize the civil and political rights of this population so that they can truly participate in our societies. We believe that it is fundamental to have accessibility to ensure that our cities and our environments are truly open to all. Let us train society and professionals in all areas of society to guarantee that no one is left behind. Let us compile information and statistics to understand where we continue to face barriers that block access for persons with disabilities from enjoying life in general. And finally, let us consider the fundamental participation of persons with disabilities in the design, planning and follow-up of all development policies. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much for that intervention. I will give the floor now to Mexico.
Thank you, moderator. From Mexico, we call to strengthen the collaborative nature of the 2030 Agenda through a constructive dialogue among the governments, civil society, and other stakeholders in all the processes related to the 2030 Agenda implementation, follow-up, review, and report. In Mexico, civil society, academy, and private sector have a permanent seat with voice and vote in the recently installed National Council for the Implementation of the 2030 Agenda. Fact that we see as a good practice and also as the first step of many to a collaborative, inclusive, and continuous multi-stakeholder dialogue towards the achievement of the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you, Mexico, for that intervention. I will give the floor now to Katarina Popovic, who's a member of the Education Academia Stakeholder Group. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'd like to make a comment related to the topic of this year's HLPF and to talk a bit about resilient cities. So the cities are the environment for millions of people of different age, sex, nationality, religion, place where they work to create their livelihood, place poverty and inequalities are tackled, where health and education services are provided, where ecosystems are protected and personal development and human rights are or should be in the core of the process. So in a way, we could say that this is a natural environment for the cooperation also of various actors and stakeholders, because in the cities, they gather naturally around the issues relevant for all of them, for their daily life and work. So the model of the learning cities that we are exploring and practicing is a structurally improved concept of community learning, and the good thing about it is it integrates all 3 dimensions. As green and healthy learning cities, they contribute to the environmental sustainable development. As equitable, inclusive learning cities, they boost individual empowerment, intercultural dialogue, and social cohesion. As economic unit, they support decent employment and entrepreneurship, contributing thus to the sustainable economic development, but also to the cultural prosperity. Further on, learning cities is the model that showcased very well how SDGs can work at a local level. And related to other SDGs, learning cities are a great example of building functioning resiliences through learning, but I have to add, through transformative learning. So education for resilient cities does not mean that this education prepares people to only to adapt or to cope with whatever comes, but it should help them to be proactive, to have a say and a role in actions that shape their lives, to influence, to transform, and to be the masters of their own lives. So this is the main precondition if we want the agenda to be owned and carried by the people. Education, not for adaptation, but for the transformation. Thank you.
Thank you for those words. And now I will give the floor to the European Union.
Thank you. The European Union and its member states welcome the contribution of major groups and other stakeholders and recognize their key roles in the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. The 2030 Agenda is ambitious on civil society participation, and the EU and its member states have acknowledged that all forces are needed to help deliver and follow up on the SDGs. In this regard, the EU and its member states have been calling for more space for civil society at the United Nations. We reiterate that call. To implement the SDGs, the EU and its member states are expanding partnerships with private sector, civil society, academia, and other relevant stakeholders. They will continue to support capacity building for these actors to allow them to play their full part in designing, implementing, monitoring, and evaluating sustainable development strategies. The EU and its member states are also committed to promoting an operating space and enabling environment for CSOs with full public participation to allow them to play their roles as independent advocates, implementers, and agents of change in development education and awareness raising and in monitoring and holding authorities into account. The involvement of stakeholders is of critical importance for sustainable democratic states, accountable and transparent institutions, and the EU will continue to support domestic efforts tailored to the needs and context of each society to build such democratic states. Thank you.
Thank you, EU, for your support. I will now give the floor to Mrs. Hindu Ibrahim from the Indigenous Peoples Major Group.
Thank you. Indigenous peoples across the globe are keepers of land, territories, and resources, which we have conserved and managed sustainably for our collective survival and for the future generation. This is one of our greatest contributions to sustainable development, along with our very rich traditional knowledge in innovation that strengthens our resilience to climate change, yet these are not recognized, protected, and promoted. The major barrier for achieving SDGs for indigenous people are the prevailing oppressive political and economic system and power structure that benefit only the few and continues to disregard human rights, social justice, equity, and sustainability. Under this system of colonization, subjugation, and imposition, our land, territories, and resources are pledged with impunity. Our rights and well-being are ignored, and we end up as furthest left behind. Unless this system are removed to empower indigenous peoples and marginalized groups, the pledge on leaving no one behind only serves as an empty slogan. With the pledge of leaving no one behind to achieve the SDGs, indigenous people call to legal recognition and protect our collective right to our land, territories, and resources as an urgent action in line with implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Recognize, protect, and support our traditional system, livelihood, traditional knowledge, and innovation. Indigenous people are the right holder. We must be given priority. Establish mechanisms and institutions for the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples in SDGs process at all levels, local, national, and monitoring based on data disaggregation by ethnicity. We wish to remind that indigenous people are protecting the planet that we depend on. It is time to the world to listen and learn from us. Thank you.
Thank you for those remarks. And now I will give the floor to France.
Bonjour, merci de me donner.
Hello, thank you for giving me the floor. My name is Sarah Schoenfeld, and I am speaking on behalf of Committee 21, which is the first multi-stakeholder sustainable development group. Thanks to the French government to let the non-state actors speak. We are mobilizing to talk about 2030 in France. with its 400 members in France and territories and in the academic work and NGOs and other places. Committee 21 has a privileged position as an observatory for sustainable development in France. This is why we, for the second time, are publishing a report this year on the level of ownership of the SDGs in France. It's a report available in French and in English on the website of committee21.org. It's the fruit of all of our civil society, 80 actors in France to co-write the report. It's structured in two parts. A first part, which proposes an analysis stakeholder by stakeholder, and a second part, which is focused on the 6 SDGs of 2018 with experiences. What does the report teach us? First of all, that 2018 is the what we've hoped for 2 years in mobilizing people for 2030, thanks to two major elements. First of all, thanks to the French state that has structured a clear national framework, bringing in civil society for implementation of SDGs in France. And secondly, thanks to the intermediary group, or you might call them relay groups or focus groups that are mobilized to make sure that their activities are related to the SDGs. So the SDGs are not yet massively known and integrated in the sustainable development strategies of organizations. Only some pioneer groups, not the LDCs and others, only some leading edge groups are aligned on SDGs. We're getting there slowly thanks to the clear national framework that we have and the opinion leaders that are mobilizing. And a final message that I would like to give you here is that this report demystifies and gets rid of the hesitation regarding 2030 so that given the fact that there are some limited resources, we have to make people understand that this is a new part of the picture, which is not an obligation which is part of the other obligations that we've had or social obligations. It's really something new. We have to overcome this culture of rejection of it. It's necessary for sustainable development. That's why we insist on Committee 21 and why we are prepared to cooperate internationally with other like-minded groups. Thank you.
France for those that information, and I will now turn the floor to the major group of workers and trade unions. It's my pleasure to give the floor to Sandra Vermuyten.
Thank you very much, Chair. The workers and trade unions believe that the 2030 agenda can provide an alternative narrative to neoliberal policies that drive a race to the bottom and exploitative trade agreements that favor multinationals over the public interest. However, we remain very critical when it comes to the SDGs implementation policy framework. Throughout the SDG and FFD negotiations, we have held the opinion that this agenda could end up being a vehicle for privatization and maintaining the status quo. Unconditional criteria are needed to ensure that private sector intervention is in line with the public interest, especially when public resources are used to support the private sector. If the governments are serious about addressing poverty, wages and decent work have to be at the center of this agenda, as well as the provision of quality public services. And our contributions on SDGs 6, 7 and 11 earlier this week echo these arguments. The trade union movement contributes to this process very actively through its participation in multiple UN bodies, including the HLPF, regional UN bodies and VNR processes, which should be more transparent and inclusive. Sustainable development is certainly also a subject matter for social dialogue, since it requires social and economic transformation, and multi-stakeholder processes cannot replace collective bargaining. Looking towards the future, you will see that next year the UN will be hit by a tsunami of trade unionists, since we will have the opportunity to firmly put labor issues at the heart of the 2030 agenda through discussions at the UN Committee on Social Development, which will address wages and inequality, the United Nations Committee on the Status of Women, which will address public services and social protection, and the HLPF that will look at decent work. 2019 is also the centenary of the ILO, whose contributions to this process we think are really essential. Finally, I would like to really support the message by the workers, the major group of young people and children, and the specific proposal to look at whether PPPs are the tool to promote the SDGs. We obviously think that is not the case. Let's make sure that the SDGs put people first, people over profit. Thank you.
Thank you, the Speaker for Workers and Trade Unions, and we see that there is the solidarity with the yellow color with the women's major group. I will give the floor now to Catherine Adams from LIDE Foundation, who will be speaking on behalf of the NGO's major group.
Thank you. I speak on behalf of the NGO major group to the question of cross-cutting challenges in achieving the SDGs and ways to address these challenges. All of us here have a desire to achieve the 2030 agenda, and yet we stall. We gather people together in forums of communication and share ideas that at the close of sessions somehow do not make it out of those session halls. Funding waits for monitoring and evaluation. Projects wait for funding. Monitoring and evaluation waits for capacity to be raised. And somewhere in the process of going from plan to action, from goal to achievement, the momentum is lost. At the core of this delay is the challenge of simply working together, collaborating, coordinating, communicating. In each and every goal under review this year, our members called for inclusion of all stakeholders in all stages of planning, policymaking, implementation, and accountability. In each goal under review, we saw also the need to work across sectors in order to achieve what seems to be a one-sector issue. None of these issues fit neatly into one finite box. They spill out and over. Water is affected by the health of our terrestrial lands, which is affected by the choices we make in energy resources and production and consumption, which affect the safety and well-being of those in our urban environments. And all of these impact and are impacted by the decisions we make and the extent to which we partner and collaborate at the policy and action planning levels. So how do we break through the stall and move towards actions? We must work collaboratively and act holistically. And that means reaching across sectors and outside the boxes of each goal, not just to solve our own problems, but also to address the deeper issues that result in delays. We must also change the processes of collaboration. Rather than just speaking for all society, we must listen to society. Rather than cutting off funding to young grassroots organizations who do not know how to submit budgets and to analyze outcomes, we must raise their capacity to do these things on their own. Instead of turning human rights into a politically charged and forbidden word, we must place it at the heart of our actions. We must be given a place to speak, and we must make space for listening in true dialogue in order to find solutions together. This is how we will build resiliency that will sustain. So at the close of this HLPF, let us open the doors to action. Merci.
Thank you so much. And now I will give the floor to Lilian Sol Cuevas from the Women's Major Group.
Gracias, moderadora.
Thank you, moderator.
Mexico, and I speak on behalf of the Women's Major Group. Patriarchy, colonialism, and other systems of oppression interact to reinforce inequalities, deny women and girls their agency, and block progress toward achieving sustainable development and solving many of the ongoing global crises. This is reflected in the ways that women bear disproportionate burdens of development failures. Unequal structures, including the current economic model, lead to climate change and ecological degradation, militarization and conflict,
on just ecosystem, financial, trade and investment governance, corporate capture and wealth concentration, illicit financial flows, land and resource grabbing, to name only a few. Space is closing for civil society. Girls and women's and feminist groups face additional challenges. We are attacked for being women's groups, criminalized and harassed in person and online, starved of funding to do the critical work on SDGs and structural change. The CSW, the Human Rights Council, and the Esquire Agreement adopted this year all refer to a state's responsibility to take steps to protect and ensure safety of girls and women and environmental human rights defenders. That commitment is lacking in the Agenda 2030, but it's absolutely essential to enable a holistic realization of Agenda 2030. Members of the Women's Major Group are doing creative and persistent work in countries around the world on implementation and accountability. We are committed to documenting that work and sharing that knowledge broadly so that civil society colleagues, the UN, and member states alike can learn from it. One example is an annual survey of women's groups' participation in the VNR process, and another is a set of guidelines to support participation in country VNRs, as well as to develop alternative reports. Our work also includes critically monitoring the implementation of SDGs through alternative reports using feminist development justice indicators to shift the current power, resource, and wealth inequalities. Feminists worldwide, not just in this room, are constantly pushing for progress and breaking down barriers. We are taking action that leaves no one behind, putting people over profit, leading to the actual transformative change that we all need. Thank you.
Thank you, Lilian, for that intervention. And now I will give the floor to the Asia-Pacific Regional Coordination Engagement Mechanism. It is my pleasure to introduce Guardalina, who is the co-chair of the mechanism.
Thank you. I would like to share our experience in Asia-Pacific. Since 2014, we established Asia-Pacific Regional CSO Engagement Mechanism that we call RCEM, a platform initiated, driven, and owned by Asia-Pacific CSOs and aimed to work with the UN system across the region. Our structure designed to harness grassroots voices and people's movements. That's why, since our establishment, we work with 17 constituencies, including migrants, LGBTIQ, people living affected by HIV, and etc. We would like to share some of our key reflection points. One, in terms of the SDGs, we found it's really important to have the regional processes. We want to make sure that our position reflect the grounded realities from grassroots and people's movement with bottom-up approach to consolidate our position. Regional Forum of Sustainable Development give us proximity and accessibility. Not everyone, not all of us can go to New York. This is to make sure that the most marginalized and grassroots organization able to come and share the reality from the ground. It creates coherence, grounded, progressive position on systemic issues that is reflected in the outcome document of the Regional Forum. However, greater linkages needs to be done between Regional Forum on Sustainable Development and HLPF, which we found still very weak. The second one is actually the importance of belief on movements. The essential ingredients of solidarity, of shared objective, and respect for all community are the key ingredients of APRSEM. The platform for 600 organizations is successful because we all enter it with the shared desire for development justice that allow us to enter it with a trust. The private sector that is represented by the small and micro enterprises and collective enters with the partnership with the shared vision for redistributive and economic justice, not a vision for more profit. Men enter into it with a shared vision for gender justice and not personal power. And all of us enter it with a shared vision of environmental and ecological justice for our planet and strengthening accountability for the people. We thank you.
Thank you so much for those powerful words. And now I will give the floor to the representative of business and industry.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for this short time. Just to
to say that at business and industry we welcome and we need partnerships. For the first time, we have been invited to participate at this sort of global effort, and we have clear that business cannot replace the state, and we need partnerships from major groups here, represented here and elsewhere. We have two events here at HLPF that we would like to highlight: the Exchange Partnership tomorrow and the SDG Business Forum next week. So you're invited and welcome to participate. Last but not least, also part of the agenda of this meeting today, on the reporting side, more and more companies are trying, at least the proactive companies are trying to report on their SDG efforts. We are aware of some SDG washing around the globe, but we try to report the initial efforts of the business industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And with those remarks, we can come back to the panel and hear the reaction of our panelists before we hear if there is anyone from the floor who wants to engage in a dialogue. So, Madam Magda, you have the floor.
Well, as grassroots women, we have been working with the indigenous communities. We have been working in local territories. We are looking after the environment, and we are working on food security. For us, grassroots women prioritize partnerships and platforms so that we can all work together. We have been working with local governments on training, and we have been setting out risk maps so that we can better understand vulnerabilities. And all of this work has led us to strengthen our own practice. So for us, the most important thing is to be able to work together through partnerships on platforms and to try to strengthen the basic resilience that we have. That's what we have been working on to try to address all of these matters, because it's not the same thing being in the cities and being in the countryside. The difficulties that we face are not all the same. We don't all own our own land, but we have been working on our own practices. We produce food. So that is why we've agreed on Goal 11 within the countryside to try to work on the environment, etc. And this is how we can consolidate our positions and say that we will achieve these Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I would like to invite then Mr. Ruben Sonderbank to give us his final remarks.
Well, I thank everyone for the valuable contributions. Based on your feedback, I would say the point that I raised, that we need more equal scientific capacity all over the world, has become even more clearer. It's not just because we need the local scientific knowledge on the local contextuality for the implementation, but we also need the local contextual scientific knowledge to feed the global discourse, because too often the global discourse is only shaped by those that have the capacity. And for that we need open science. I think that's crucial, that all delegates here, but also all stakeholders get the access to the science, which is now often behind paywall, only accessible to a few. And we all need this information. Which also means I think we need the freedom of science more and more. Scientific facts and knowledge can be inconvenient, and now that we have alternative facts available, there are ways out. And I think we should, that's more the task maybe for the scientific community, listening especially to my colleagues from the other major groups and stakeholders, is to also ensure that within academia, we make sure that we don't leave anyone behind, based on whatever criteria people might not be able to access a university or school in the first place, or might not get the grant for a big research project. This is partly up to member states, but I think also within academia we should take this principle of the Agenda 2030 to leave no one behind seriously.
Thank you for those remarks. Ms. Jolie is, she had to leave the room, so now in her place, I will give the floor to the Children and Youth Major Group.
Thank you very much. Everyone, just a final word from the side of the Major Group and of Children and Youth. My name is Julius Kramer. I come from the World Organization of the Scout Movement. I'm speaking on behalf of the Major Group of Children and Youth. To member states, if you see this session as going back to school and learning from all of the amazing stakeholders with knowledge and competencies here today, first, what's your main takeaway from today's lesson? What will you bring back to your governments or your respective implementation processes? And secondly, if you see yourself as successful at national level stakeholder engagement in the implementation of the 2030 Agenda, firstly, have you asked stakeholders if they agree? And secondly, how will you teach and convince other member states here these upcoming days to do the same? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, now we have arrived to the final part of our roundtable. I would just like to say that in all this discussion, it seems like there are two ways to approach the achievement of the Sustainable Development Agenda. One is more formal. It needs a technical approach. It requires a lot of work. But the other is the human side and the environmental side that is alive. And that requires for us to have a balance of the subjective side of the implementation, and not only to come here to HLPF to deliver facts and figures, because no matter how important data is, the Sustainable Development Agenda has at the core also the dimension of, let us say, what is meaningful for life to thrive. So the stakeholders are bringing that dimension, and we would urge you to consider notions such as governance, because some member states think that stakeholders are enemies or that are challenging to your mandate to fulfill the 2030 Agenda. But we would like to say that on our side, we are standing right along the 2030 Agenda. So we are not enemies of the 2030 Agenda. We are not enemies of the human rights framework, of the environmental sustainability, or of gender equality. And if that's the side you are as governments, then we are on the same side. And we want to be engaged in the implementation of this agenda. And yes, we want to address the challenges and address the obstacles and find common solutions. So we want to invite you to keep on having this dialogue, not in this plenary room, but outside in your engagement with your local and national communities at the regional level, and here in New York or in Geneva to talk about how we can come up with the best solutions. And certainly that requires that there is a guarantee for the safety, the dignity, and the freedom of all the citizens who are also trying to engage in their most heartfelt manner to try to achieve this agenda. So this is why we would like to keep on having this very serious conversation, that for us is very serious, about how to improve the modalities, not only in terms of the formalities of a forum, but really in the meaningful way in which we can advance together to achieve this dream by 2030. So thank you very much. And I'll give the floor back to the President.
Delegates, I think you have to join us in thanking the moderator and the panelists and discussant over there again. I think we should give them another applause. You know, in this session, we had different views, different stakeholders. And I think it's importance of the high-level political forum that we can listen to one another, especially those who are in government, to listen to the views of those who are outside government, but still very important stakeholders. We've taken notes of your views, the issues that you highlighted, the things that you think we should improve upon. We've taken particular notes of the issues brought by the indigenous people, how they want us to continue to address their issues. And there was a point made by somebody representing people living with disabilities. And she was saying that perhaps in our planning forward, implementation, we should not forget people living with disabilities, especially those in the rural areas. I think it's a point that we need to take seriously on as we move on. I also just have gone through the ministerial declaration and try to understand why, maybe perhaps as going forward, we need to look at our declaration. I was just reflected through the declaration on the views that were brought in by the other stakeholders, and especially those who were brought by the previous panel on the link between regional organization, regional efforts, and high-level political forum. I think these are very important things. So what we'll do, we'll pass on all these lessons and views to the next bureau, because our bureau come to an end very soon. So we hope that the next bureau will improve things, as well as the issue brought by the private sector or business and other investments. So industries, I think we'll bring those issues. But I think I can guarantee them it was a first invitation, but it's not the last invitation, the business and industry. Okay, with that remarks, we have then come to the end of work this morning. The High-Level Political Forum will reconvene in the afternoon, same hall, at 3 p.m. And we'll look into Goal 12, ensure sustainable consumptions and production patterns. We'll get more information from the next president, but that's where Jerry ends. Thank you very much, and the meeting is adjourned.